Chapter 30 of Behind the Throne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Behind the Throne by William le Queux. The Path of the Tempter. An hour had passed, and Mary, against her inclination, had danced with various partners, and had heard around her comments regarding her personal beauty and her dress such as always reached her ears on such occasions. Everyone courted and flattered her, for in that gay court circle she was one of its reigning queens. Yet the hot air stifled her, the mingled perfumes of flowers and chiffons nauseated her. She hated it all, and was longing to get away back to the solitude of her own room, where, after old Teresa had brushed her hair, she might sit in her big easy-chair and think. Blasée of life before her time, she was disappointed, world-weary and heartbroken, although as yet only in her early womanhood. She had been dancing with the young Prince de Sarcina, a well-known figure in Roman society, and he had led her to a seat beside the old Duchess of Rovicourt, when, in the lull of the music, those mysterious knocks were again repeated, and at the further end of the ballroom there stood the black-habited royal chamberlain. There was silence at once. Then the royal official announced in Italian in a loud, ringing voice, "His Majesty the King!" And at the same moment a pair of long gilt and blue doors were flung open, and into the room there advanced the sovereign, a well-set-up, pleasant-faced figure with white moustache, before whom all bowed low 3 times in obeisance as he strode with regal gait into the centre of the enormous ballroom. In his splendid uniform, outrivalling all and wearing the grand crosses of the crown of Italy, Maurice and Lazarus, and Savoy orders of which he was master, his figure presented a fitting centre to that brilliant assembly, and soon, when the obeisances were made and he had saluted in return, he moved away in conversation with Marini, who, as all were aware, was one of his most intimate friends. Then, when the Queen, wearing her wonderful pearls, entered with the same ceremony together with the Crown Prince and Princess of Naples, the orchestra struck up again, and the revelry continued notwithstanding the presence of the sovereigns, who mixed freely with their guests and laughed and talked with them. Presently, as Mary on the arm of a partner was passing near to where Her Majesty was sitting upon the raised dais at the end of the room, the Queen suddenly beckoned to her, whereupon she left the man who was her escort, curtsied as etiquette demanded, and approached the royal presence. "I only heard the news the day before yesterday on our return from Berlin," exclaimed Her Majesty in English with a kindly smile as the girl came up to her. "But of course your engagement scarcely comes as a surprise. Let me congratulate you. You must present the Count to me at the first opportunity. Is he now in Rome?" "No, madam," was the girl's blushing reply, "but I thank your Majesty for your kind thought of me." "I wish you every happiness, my dear," declared the Queen, for Mary was an especial favourite with her. "Perhaps I may be able to attend your wedding. When will it be?" "In June, madam." "Very well. Give me good notice of the date, and I'll see if I can come." And then she dismissed the minister's daughter by turning to speak with one of her ladies-in-waiting, who had returned from executing some commission upon which her royal mistress had sent her. What irony, thought the girl as she curtsied and left the royal the trap into which she had fallen. Through those high-roofed, magnificent chambers, with their wonderful friezes, priceless paintings, and gilt furniture, she wandered on, acknowledging greetings on every hand, yet only mechanically, for her thoughts were far away from that scene of royal revelry. The atmosphere held her asphyxiated, the music jarred upon her ears, and the gossip she heard on every side was for her devoid of all interest. One face alone arose before her amid that glittering throng, the face of the Englishman she had met so unexpectedly that morning, George Macbean. And why? She asked herself that question, and yet to it could give no direct response. His frank honesty of countenance and his muscular English form attracted her, but when the suggestion crossed her mind that she loved him, she laughed such an idea to scorn. They were comparative strangers, and she prided herself on being one who had never fallen into the error of affection at first sight, as so many other girls did. Her character, it was true, was too well balanced for that. Yet the truth remained that all her thoughts that day had been of him. Both the Baron Riboulet, the French ambassador, and old Prince Demidov had grasped her hand and paid their compliments, while the princess managed to whisper in French, "I never saw you looking so well as tonight, my dear. That gown suits you admirably, and is by far the most striking here. One cannot wonder at Count Dubar's choice. He has always been known in Paris as a connoisseur of beauty, you know." And Her Excellency the Princess showed her yellow teeth in a broad grin at what she meant as humour. Wherever Mary went, half a dozen of the younger men followed in her train like bees about their queen. She laughed with them, made humorous remarks, and chatted to them with that air of bright, irresponsible gaiety by which she so cleverly concealed the heavy burden of grief and disappointment that filled her heart. In Roman society the younger men vied with each other to become friends of Mary Marini, hence at such functions as these they liked to be seen in her company, laughing or dancing with her. The young Duke di Ferrano, who had recently returned from Paris, where he had acted as first secretary of the Italian embassy, had taken her in to supper in the huge winter garden, where the tiny tables were set beneath the palms, and they had been waited upon by the royal servants. In the dim light of the Chinese lanterns the Duke, an old friend, had taken her hand in his, but she had withdrawn it in indignation, saying, "You have no right to do that now that I am engaged." "Ah, yes, of course," he exclaimed with a word of apology at once interested. "I heard something about it in Paris, but quite forgot. Jules de Bar is the lucky fellow, isn't he?" She nodded. And as she looked into his dark, well-cut features in the half-light, she fancied she discerned a curious look, half of pity and half of surprise. "I hope you'll be happy," he remarked in a hard voice. "I always thought you would marry Solaro, poor devil. Do you remember him?" "Remember?" she echoed. "Yes, I recollect everything." "You may well say poor devil. He has been convicted of being a traitor, of selling army secrets to France." I know," answered her companion quickly. "We had all the papers concerning the charges through the embassy, and I am aware of all the facts. My own idea is that he's innocent, yet how can it be proved? He was betrayed by some heartless woman in Bologna, it seems. She made all sorts of charges against him." "She lied," cried Mary quickly. "He is innocent. I know he is, and some day I hope to be able to prove it." "Ah, I wish I could help you," was his fervent declaration. "He was my friend, you know. Perhaps the real truth may be known some day, but until then we can only wait, and he must bear his unjust punishment." "But it is a crying scandal that he should have been degraded when he is innocent," declared the daughter of the Minister of War. "Your father, no doubt, ordered the most searching inquiry. It is strange that, if he is really innocent, his innocence has not been proved." "You are quite right," she said. "That very fact is always puzzling me." "There may be some reason why he has been consigned to prison," remarked the diplomatist, thoughtfully twisting his champagne glass by the stem, "some reason of state of which we are ignorant." "But my father would never willingly be party to such an injustice." "Probably not. But what seems possible is that Solaro is held in prison by some power greater than your father's, the power of your father's enemies." She thought deeply over those strange words of his. It almost seemed as though he were actually in possession of the truth, and yet feared to reveal it to her. Presently they rose again and returned to where the cotillion had commenced. She did not take part in it because her heart was too full for such frivolities. The young diplomatist had left her at a seat when almost immediately her father's enemy Angelo Borselli approached and bowed low over her hand. She knew well how he had endeavoured to ruin and disgrace her father, and how he intended to hold the office of minister himself, yet, owing to the instructions His Excellency had given her, she treated him with that clever diplomacy which is innate in woman. In common with her father, she never allowed him to discern that she entertained the slightest antipathy towards him, and treated him with calm dignity as she had always done. Borselli, in ignorance that the minister was aware of all the ramifications of his shrewd scheming, still affected the same friendship for Marini and his family, and affected it with a marvellous verisimilitude of truth. One of the cleverest political schemers in Europe, he was unrivalled even by Vito Ricci, who in the past had performed marvels of political duplicity. Yet Mary's tact was a match for him. Only 3 days ago she and her father had dined at his big new mansion in the Via Salaria, and neither man had betrayed any antagonism towards the other. It is often so in this modern world of ours. Men who inwardly hate each other are outwardly the best of friends. Neither Marini nor Mary had any trust in him, however, for both knew too well that he intended by some clever coup one day to deal the blow and triumph as usurper. Yet both, while wary and silent, masked their true feelings of suspicion beneath the cloak of indifference and friendliness. Having taken a seat beside her, he began to gossip pleasantly, while his dark eyes were darting quick glances everywhere, when suddenly he asked, "Is not Jules here? I thought he was commanded here tonight." "No, to the next ball. He is in Paris," she said simply, without desire to discuss the man to whom she had engaged herself. "And you do not regret his absence, eh?" remarked the Sicilian in a low voice, bringing his sallow, sinister face nearer to hers. "I do not understand you," she exclaimed, drawing herself up with some hauteur. "What is your insinuation?" "Nothing," was his low response. "You need not be offended, for I do not mean it in that sense. I merely noticed how you were enjoying yourself this evening during his absence, and the conclusion is but natural." And his face relaxed into a smile. "Well," she declared, as across her face fell a shadow of quick annoyance, "I consider, General, your remark entirely uncalled for," and she rose stiffly to leave him. But he only smiled again, a strange, crafty smile that rendered his thin, sallow face the more forbidding, as he answered in a low voice, speaking almost into her ear and fixing his eyes on hers. "I may surely be forgiven as an old friend if I approach the truth in confidence, Signora. You have accepted that man's offer of marriage, but you have done so under direct compulsion. You desire to escape from your compact. You see I am aware of the whole truth. Well, there is one way by which you may escape, but recollect that what I tell you is in the strictest secrecy and confidence from your father, from everyone. I speak as your friend. There is a way by which you can avoid making this loveless alliance which is naturally distasteful to you, a way by which, if you choose to adopt it, you may save yourself." She faced the man, her brown eyes meeting his in speechless surprise and wonder at his enigmatical words. What could he mean? End of chapter 30.
Chapter 31 of Behind the Throne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Anita Shabazian, Behind the Throne by William LeQueux, in which a double game is played. I do not quite follow you, General, faltered Mary after a brief pause, regarding him with a puzzled air. Then let us find a quiet corner where we can be alone, and I will explain, said Borselli, rising and offering the girl his arm. Both were well acquainted with all the ramifications of the splendid state apartments, the antechambers, the winter garden, and the corridors. Therefore, he led her through the throne room to a small apartment at the rear of the hall of the princess. An elegant little room hung with pale green silk, and the gilt furniture of which bore embroidered on the backs of the chairs the royal crown with the black eagle and white cross of Savoy. So cleverly did Angelo Borselli conceal his schemes and his hatreds that through years he had deceived so shrewd and far-seeing a man as his chief Marini. His insinuating address and rather handsome exterior rendered him, if not welcome in Roman society, at least tolerated, more especially as through him recommendations could be made to Marini, whose word was law on every point concerning the army of Italy. A certain degree of suspicion and some feeling of awe attended him, though it was rather in his absence than his presence. For his ready wit and fluent conversation were not calculated to inspire other than agreeable thoughts. It was only as he cast himself into a chair at her side, hesitating how to put the matter before her, that in the glance of his dark, sparkling, deeply set eyes might have been detected a sinister motive and a searching and eager expression at variance with the frank and joyous manner of a moment before. That glance betrayed the depth of the man's cunning. "You have no love for Dubard," he remarked slowly. "I have watched, and I have seen it plainly. Yet you are engaged to him because he has compelled you to accept him as your husband. He holds a certain power over you. When he orders you dare not disobey. Am I not correct?" he asked, looking straight into her brown, wide-open eyes. She nodded in the affirmative, and a slight sigh escaped her. She was suspicious of him, but did not recognize the trend of his argument. "Then let us advance a step further," he said in the same quiet, serious manner. "It is but natural you desire to escape from him. He is repugnant to you, perhaps you loathe him, and yet you wear a mask of pretended happiness. Surely you cannot take up life beside a husband whom you secretly despise. You are a woman who desires to love and be loved, a woman who should marry a man worthy your reverence and self-sacrifice," he added, in a voice which seemed to her full of a genuine solicitude for her future. His attitude was full of mystery. The sudden interest which he, her father's bitterest enemy, betrayed on her behalf was inexplicable. "Well," she faltered at last, "and if I really desire to break off my engagement with the Count, what course do you suggest?" "You must break your engagement, Signorina," he exclaimed quickly. "For several weeks I have desired to speak plainly and frankly to you, but I feared that certain distorted facts having perhaps come to your ears, you might treat me as your enemy rather than your friend. But tonight, finding you alone, I resolved to speak and, if possible, to save you from sacrificing yourself to a man so unworthy of you." "But I always thought he was your friend," she exclaimed in surprise, looking straight at the man before her and toying with her big feathered fan. "We are friends. We have been guests together under your father's roof in England, you will remember," he admitted. "Yet I entertain too much respect for your father and his family to stand by and see you become the victim of such a man as Jules Dubard. You are his friend, and yet you speak evil of him behind his back," she remarked. "No, I do not speak evil in the least. You misunderstand my motive. It is in the interests of your own well-being and future happiness. We must not allow that man to force you into an odious union. He is clever, but you must outwit him. Your duty to yourself is to do so." "But how can I?" she asked, with a desperation in her voice that came involuntarily, but which revealed to Borselli her eagerness to escape from the web which Dubard had weaved about her. The future of that beautiful girl, the most admired of all that brilliant throng at court, was the future of Italy. Angelo Borselli knew it, and recognized what an important part that handsome daughter of the minister was destined to play. "There is one way, only one way," he answered, bending towards her, speaking confidentially, and keeping his deep-set eyes fixed upon hers. "The man Dubard has very cleverly succeeded in forcing you to accept him as husband, but you must escape from your present peril by revealing the truth." "The truth of what?" "The truth of that man's motives." "But they are all a mystery. How can I ascertain the truth?" "There is one man who knows, one man who, if he chose to speak, could at once give you freedom." "But who is he?" she inquired eagerly. "Felice Solaro, your friend." "Solaro!" she gasped. "But he is in prison in Turin, condemned for 15 years for treason, for an offense of which he is not guilty," declared the under-secretary quickly. "Ah, and that is your opinion as mine, General," she cried eagerly. "I know he is innocent. Then secure his release. Persuade your father to sign a decree reversing the finding of the court-martial, and he, in turn, can save you from falling victim to this man to whom you are giving yourself in marriage." Angela Borselli met her piercing glance unmoved. She seemed to be trying to divine the schemer's secret thoughts. "You will do this for your own sake," he whispered earnestly. "It is unjust that the poor captain should be kept in prison for a crime of which he is innocent. But if you know that he is not guilty, why have you not already used your own influence as under-secretary to secure his release?" she asked, with distinct suspicion, 1,000 uneasy thoughts agitating her bosom. "Because I am powerless. It is only His Excellency, your father, who can sign decrees," was his reply, adding, "I have more than once directed his attention to the act of gross injustice." But his reply has in each case been the same, namely that he had examined the evidence, and that he could discover no doubt about the captain's culpability in selling the secrets of Trecenta and of our mobilization scheme. For the protection of the French frontier, both secrets actually reached the intelligence department of the French Ministry of War, for that has been proved beyond doubt by our secret agents in Paris. And further, they passed through the hands of a lady friend of Solaro's, Filomena Nodari. Where is that woman now? Still in Bologna? No, I think not, was his reply, without, however, telling her how he had taken the woman into his service and sent her to England. I learned a short time ago that she had left and gone abroad. It was through her false evidence that Felice was convicted. She told foul untruths concerning him, his companion cried angrily. I know. Perhaps it is owing to fear of the truth being exposed that she has left Bologna. But in any case, it is only common justice that poor Solaro should be released. He has never had a chance of a proper appeal. Your father refused it to him. But why? Has my father any reason why the poor fellow should be kept in prison? Angelo Borselli raised his shoulders and exhibited his palms in a gesture more forcible than mere words. And if he has, then how can I hope to succeed in turning his favor towards the accused man? Try, do your utmost, signorina, he urged, with perhaps more eagerness than was really warrantable in such circumstances. Appeal to your father's sense of justice, to his honor, to his reputation as one always ready to redress wrongs. You, as his daughter, can accomplish everything if you wish, even the freedom of Felice Solaro. And if I do, then he will speak the truth, and you need have no fear of the man who has so cleverly entrapped you into this engagement. When the truth is out, he will at once relinquish his claim to your hand. She hesitated. She was wondering whether the crafty statesman who had risen by her father's favors was really aware of the secret compact she had made with Dubard, whether he knew that she had given her hand to him in exchange for his protection of her father's honor. Jules had seen her a few days after the curious scene in the Chamber of Deputies. He had come to her to receive the payment he had demanded in the shape of a formal engagement of marriage, but he had told her nothing concerning the manner in which he had managed to avert the crisis, and she only knew the story of the letter to Montebruno through Vito Ricci, her father's spy. She was unaware of Jules's visit to the man now before her, or of his threat to make revelations if the fatal question were asked in the chamber. Women of Mary Morini's type rise to higher heights of sacrifice and, when determined, act with a courage rare among men. She is herself in 1,000 ways men never dare to be, and a fine woman is worth 100 of the finest men. But if you are really speaking in my own interests as my friend general, why cannot you furnish me with the weapon by which I can defend myself from him? She suggested at last. For 2 reasons. First, your parents, ignorant of the real facts, are delighted at the prospect of your marriage. Secondly, Solaro alone holds the truth. He can speak and prove his facts. Regarding what? Regarding Jules Dubard. Regarding the man whom you still allege is your friend? Really, General, the manner in which you exhibit friendship towards others is a rather curious one, if this is an example of it. He was unprepared for such a remark from her, but it showed him, nevertheless, how frank and fearless she had become. I merely offer you my advice, signorina, he answered, shifting slightly in his chair and settling his sword. It is surely 1,000 pities that you should become the victim of a man of Dubard's stamp, when by a little clever maneuvering you may not only do an act of justice by freeing poor Solaro, but also free yourself from the engagement into which you have entered against your will. But you tell me that my father has already refused to release the captain, she remarked, regarding him with a puzzled air. If this is so, then what can I do further? Persuade him. You alone can induce him to act as you desire. Recollect that upon that man's liberty your own future depends. The Sicilian, careful student of the human character as he was, knew well that a generous, magnanimous woman, like the one before him, is more ingenious and confident in well-doing than any man. He had carefully watched her, and by means of his secret agents knew that she entertained no love for the man to whom she had become engaged. Therefore, with his unequaled cunning, he had devised a fresh means of making his coup and attaining his end in spite of Jules Dubard. He watched her beautiful countenance and saw that his words had created an impression. A grave injustice had been done in degrading and imprisoning the handsome young captain who had once admired her so, and he knew that she would seek to remedy it. He had given her a strong and direct motive for securing Solaro's release, her own liberty. "Very well," she sighed at last. "I thank you, General, for speaking to me so frankly. I will see what I can do in order to obtain a pardon for him. But if I do, will you promise to assist me in the matter which concerns me personally? I promise you that Solaro shall tell the truth, that on the day following his release, you shall be placed in a position to defy this man who believes that you have fallen his victim. Do you agree?" She was silent for a moment, still distrustful of the man who had so narrowly encompassed her father's downfall. Yet she recollected that the face of politics changes quickly, and in a low voice and with sudden resolution answered, "I do." He stretched forth his white-gloved hand, and without further word she took it in pledge of good faith. She had in her desperation made terms with the enemy, and as the under-secretary rose to escort her back through the gay assembly in the staterooms, a faint, good-humored smile flitted across his sallow features. He felt confident that his craft and cunning must succeed, that she would obtain Solaro's release, and then the triumph for which he had so long and patiently waited would be his. True, the fate of men's lives and nations' destinies was often juggled with in those great gilded halls where the air was heavy with perfume, the ear charmed with delightful music, and the eye dazzled by the glitter of that brilliant court, every member of which, man or woman, schemed, struggled, and intrigued to satisfy their own vices or their own ambitions. End of section 31. Chapter 32 of Behind the Throne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Anita Shahbazian. Behind the Throne by William LeQueux. The Birth of Love. George and Mary met frequently in the days that followed. His Excellency was still suffering from an attack of that prostrating malady Roman fever, and George, as his private secretary, was daily in attendance upon him. Marini liked the young man for his honest English sturdiness of character, his diligent application to his duties, and his enthusiasm for all that was beneficial to the army. He had quickly picked up his duties, and already the Minister of War found his assistance indispensable. He worked a good deal in the big old library of the palace, wherein the minister's daughter and wife often entered to salute him, and sometimes to give him an invitation to remain to luncheon, when the conversation would generally be upon English matters in general, and things at Orton and Thornby in particular. Both mother and daughter delighted in their English home, and always regretted leaving it for that fevered existence they were compelled to lead continually in the Italian capital. Mary was already engaged. Otherwise, neither Marini nor his wife would probably have allowed the two young people to be thrown so constantly into each other's society. Thus, however, the bond of friendship gradually became strengthened between them, he loving her fondly in secret, while she regarded him as a man in whom she might one day confide. She had no friend in whom she could trust, save her father. Amid her 1,000 acquaintances in that brilliant world around the throne, there was not one who would not betray her confidence at the moment any profit might be made out of it. Therefore she kept herself to herself, and mixed with them only as etiquette or her father's policy demanded. George McBean was, on his part, filled with wonder. She was actually to marry Jules Dubard, that man of all men. Surely her parents were in ignorance of who and what the fellow had been. Surely by his clever cunning and shrewd maneuvering he had misled even the sharp-eyed minister himself, and induced him to give his consent to his daughter's marriage. He pitied Mary, pitied her from the bottom of his heart. He knew that there must be some secret which she held and would not divulge, for if not, why should she regard her forthcoming marriage with such a lack of enthusiasm? Why, indeed, should she purposely abstain from discussing Dubard? He closely watched her, and recognized how she had sadly changed since those bright days at Orton. Upon her brow was now a settled expression of deep thought and sadness, and when she thought herself unobserved a low sigh would sometimes escape her, as though her thoughts were bitter ones. Was it possible that she suspected the truth concerning Jules Dubard? Was it even possible that she was marrying him under compulsion? In the silence of his own apartment he sat for hours, smoking his English pipe and wondering, while the babble of sounds of the foreign city came up from the street below. How strange were the ways of the world, how bitter the ironies of life. He loved her, ah yes. He loved her with all the passion of his soul, with all the deep and earnest devotion of which an honest man is capable. Yet, poor as he was, merely her father's underling, how could he ever hope to gain her hand? No, he sighed day after day, it was hopeless, utterly hopeless. Hers was to be a marriage of convenience. She was to wed Dubard and become a countess. But if he only dared to speak, he might save her, but at what cost? His own disgrace and ruin, and he bit his lip to the blood. Fortune had lifted him out of the drudgery of Morgan Mason's service and brought him there to Rome, to a position of confidence envied by 10,000 others. Could he possibly sacrifice his future, his very life, just as it had suddenly opened up to him? And he pondered on, meeting her, talking with her, and each hour falling deeper under the spell of her marvelous grace and beauty. Mary, on her part, was full of thought. A frightful gulf was opened before her. She could not fly from its brink. She was goaded onwards, though she saw it yawning beneath her feet. While sitting alone with her father in his room one evening, she approached the subject of Felice Solaro, but he instantly poured forth such a flood of invectives upon the condemned man that she was compelled to at once change the subject. To her it seemed that for some unaccountable reason he was prejudiced against the imprisoned man, and anything she might say in his favor only served to condemn him the more. On looking back upon the past, she found that she had regarded love as a matter of everyday occurrence. She heard of it, saw it wherever she moved. Every man who approached her either felt or feigned it, and so accustomed was she to homage and devotion that its absence alone attracted her attention. She had considered it part of her state, and yet of the real nature of true affection she had been perfectly unconscious. She had more than once imagined herself in love, as in the case of Felice Solaro, mistaking gratified vanity for a deeper emotion, had felt pleasure in the presence of its object, and regret in absence. But that was a pastime and no more until now. But now she held within her heart a deep secret, the secret of her love, and this rendered her future all the more serious, her marriage all the more a fearful undertaking. She had no escape from her fate. She must marry a man who at least was indifferent to her. Could she ever suffer herself to be decked for this unpromising bridal? This union with a man who at heart was the enemy of her family and whom she hated. One evening she again met George McBean. He had returned from Naples, where he had executed a commission given him by the minister, and had reported to his chief his visit to the commandant of the military district. He afterwards sat with Mary and her mother in one of the smaller reception rooms of the ponderous old mansion. Mary, who was in a black dinner dress slightly décolleté, took up her mandolin, the instrument of which he was so fond, and sang the old Tuscan song in which, with his heart so overburdened, he discerned a hidden meaning. Io questa notte in sogno l'ho veduto, era vestito tutto di brocato, le piume sul berretto di velluto, ed una spada d'oro aveva al lato. E poi m'ha detto con un bel sorriso, io non posso più star da te diviso non si può soster, e torno per mai più non ti lasciare. These words sank as iron into his soul. Did she, he wondered, really reciprocate his concealed and unexpressed feelings? Ah, no, it was impossible, all impossible. And when she had laid aside her instrument, he commenced to describe to them the grand review of troops which he had witnessed outside Naples that morning, and how the general staff had treated him as an honored guest. Ah, sighed Madame Marini. If we were to tell the truth, Mr. McBean, both Mary and I are tired of the very sight of uniforms and the sound of military music. Wherever my husband goes in Italy, a review is always included in the program, and we have to endure the heat and the dust of the march past. Once, when I was first married, I delighted in all the glitter and display of armed forces, but nowadays I long and ever long for retirement at dear old Orton. And so do I, declared her daughter quickly. When I was at school in England, I used to look forward to the day when I would be presented at the Quirinale and enter Roman society. But oh, the weariness of it all! I have already become sick of its glare, its uncharitableness, and its intrigues. England, yes, give me dear England, or else the quiet of San Donato. You have never been there yet, Mr. McBean, she added, looking into his face. When you do go, you will find it more quiet and more beautiful than Orton. I have no doubt, he said. If it is in the Arno Valley, I know how beautiful the country is there, having passed up and down from Pisa many times. Those are photographs of it in Madame's boudoir, are they not? Oh, yes. Ah, then you've noticed them, she exclaimed. It is a delightful old place, is it not? His eyes were fixed upon hers, and he read in their dark depths the burden of sorrow that was there. Dubard was due back in Rome, but he had not returned, nor had she mentioned the reason. He wished to meet him, to observe what effect his presence would have upon that man who had robbed him of all the happiness of life. The chiming of the little French clock reminded him that it was the hour to take his leave. Therefore he rose, grasped the hands of the grave, kind-faced Englishwoman and her daughter, and went forth into the old world street, striding blindly on towards his own rooms. Really a delightful fellow, remarked her mother, when the door had closed behind him. His English manners are refreshing after those of all the apious young fools whom we are compelled for the sake of policy to entertain. But, she added with a laugh, suddenly recollecting, I ought not to say that, my dear, now that you are to marry a Frenchman. I married an Italian, and as far as my choice of a husband has gone, I am thankful to say I have never regretted it, even though our natures and our religions are different. I will never become a Catholic, never, declared Mary decisively. I do not, and I shall never believe in the confessional. Nor do I, responded her mother. But there is no need for you to change your religion. The Count has already told me that he has no such desire. By the way, he was due back the day before yesterday. Why has he not returned? I heard from him yesterday. He has gone down to the Pyrenees on business connected with the estate, he says. And then, after some further gossip regarding a charity bazaar at the German embassy, at which they were to hold a stall on the morrow, the unhappy girl rose, and with uneven steps went along the gloomy, echoing corridors to her own room. Teresa brushed her long brown tresses as she sat before her long mirror, looking at the reflection of her pale face and wondering if the young Englishman guessed the truth. Then, as soon as possible, she dismissed her faithful serving woman and still sat in her chair, her mind occupied by 1,000 thoughts which chased each other in quick succession. One thought, in spite of all her efforts, she was unable to banish. It returned again and again, and would intrude in spite of her struggles to suppress it. The image of George McBean, the man who had so suddenly become her friend. The night wore on, and in the silence of her pretty chamber she wept for some time, abandoning herself to melancholy fancies. At length, reproaching herself for thus permitting sorrow to usurp the place of that resignation which the pure faith she had adopted ought to inspire, she threw herself upon her knees and offered to heaven the homage of an afflicted and innocent heart. As she rose from her knees, the church bells of Rome were chiming one. She shuddered at the solemn stroke, for every hour seemed to bring her nearer the terrible self-sacrifice which she was compelled to make for her father's sake. Her fears had risen almost to distraction, and she had wept and prayed alternately in all the agonies of anxiety. The truth that had now forced itself upon her held her aghast, immovable. She loved George McBean. Yes, she murmured his name aloud, and her words sounded weird and distinct in the silence of the night. Yet if she withdrew from her unholy agreement with the man who had forced her to give her promise, then the hounds of destruction would be let loose upon her house. And her father? She had discovered in the drawer of his carved writing table at San Donato that tiny tube of innocent-looking tabloids, and though she kept the secret to herself, she had guessed his intention. Could she deliberately allow him to sacrifice his life when there was still a means open whereby to save him? She sank again upon her knees by the bedside and prayed long for divine help and deliverance. End of section 32.
Section 33 of Behind the Throne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. Behind the Throne by William Le Queux. Section 33. Chapter 33. Mrs. Fitzroy's Governess. Mrs. Charles Fitzroy was delighted with her new Italian governess. She had contemplated engaging a Frenchwoman or a Swiss to teach little Bertha, but most fortunately General Borselli, whom she had met during a season spent with her husband in Rome, came to her aid and recommended the daughter of the deceased, Colonel Nodari. She came, and her slight, rather tall figure in neat black, her well-cut, handsome features, and her plainly dressed hair, almost black, had attracted her mistress from the first. She was refined, unobtrusive, merry-eyed, and just the kind of bright companion and governess she required for her child. She noticed that although her dresses were well made, there were tokens, in more ways than one, that since her father's death she and her mother had fallen upon evil days. Fitzroy himself liked her. There was something interesting in her quaint, broken English, and in her foreign gestures that commended itself to him in preference to the angular, blue-stocking Miss Gardner, who had recently left his wife's service. So Mademoiselle, as they called her in preference to the rather ugly word signorina, quickly became as one of the family, and within a week of her arrival she met that pompous millionaire of eggs and bacon, Mr. Morgan Mason. The latter became as much attracted by her as were the others, but she exerted no effort to captivate or to gain admiration, merely acting her part modestly, as became the humble governess in a wealthy family. Nevertheless, she recollected the general's instructions, and more than once, in the secrecy of her room, wrote to that address in Genoa, reporting her progress. Mrs. Charles Fitzroy, a pretty and rather extravagant woman, still on the right side of 40, moved in a very good set, and entertained a good deal at her house in Brook Street. Her husband was a magnate in the city, and the fact that Morgan Mason was her brother gave her the entree to houses which would have otherwise been closed to her. Fitzroy, a rather short grey-bearded man with a florid countenance, had risen from a clerk's stool to be what he was, and differed in little particular from thousands of well-off city men who live in the West End and entertain and enter the anteroom of society. Nevertheless, through the influence of the white waistcoated member for South West Norfolk, a good many well-known people dined at Brook Street from time to time, while to Morgan Mason's smart gatherings at his house or his dinners at the Carlton, his sister and her husband were always invited. It was pleasant enough to mix with such people as surrounded her employers, but truth to tell, Philomena Nodari quickly found the post of governess monotonous and irksome. First of all, it was difficult for her to preserve her unassuming character as a paid menial. Secondly, she hated children. Thirdly, Bertha was a spoilt child, with no leaning towards lessons. And fourthly, the small bare schoolroom at the top of the house was a gloomy place in which to spend those bright spring days. Still, she never complained. She was well paid by the Minister of War, and with a woman's love of intrigue, she had set herself to carefully accomplish the difficult task which Borselli had given her. She was fortunate, inasmuch as Mrs. Fitzroy treated her with such consideration. Indeed, sometimes, when there were no visitors, she would invite her in to lunch with her, when they would generally talk French, a language in which her mistress was well acquainted. So well did she act her part that the governess was quickly voted a treasure, and as Bertha was a particular favourite of her uncle Morgan Mason, the latter became gradually interested in her. Sometimes, indeed, he would come up to the schoolroom while lessons were in progress, with an excuse to leave a packet of sweetmeats for his niece, but Philomena, with her woman's shrewd intuition, knew that he came to have a chat with her. He was inquisitive, always inquisitive. One day, as he sat with Bertha upon his knee in the schoolroom, he asked about her parentage. "You are a native of Bologna, where the sausages come from," he laughed. Perhaps he sold that comestible at his many shops, she reflected, but she answered in her broken English, "Yes, but just as none of straw hats are made in Leghorn, so there are none of Bologna sausages made in Bologna." "You must be already tired of life here in London after your beautiful Italy," he remarked. "Ah, no," she assured him. "I like your London, what little I have seen of it, but that is not very much. I take Bertha for one walk in the park, or down to what you call Kensington, every day, and many times we ascend to the roof of an omnibus. But omnibuses are so puzzling," she added with a laugh. "You never know where one goes. We always ascend and sit there till we come to the end of the voyage, but we make some amusing errors many times. Only the day before today, We ascended on a bus outside the Galerie Nationale. Where are the fountains? Paid 20 centimes, 2 pennies, eh bien? The next street corner, past the church, they turned us off. The omnibus went no further. The millionaire laughed out loud, saying, "It must have been a Royal Oak or Cricklewood bus coming home. They go no further than Charing Cross." "But oh," she continued, "we go many time a long, long way out into the country, away from London. Once we went on till I thought we would never arrest, right until we came to a small town down by the river. Tweetham, the conductor called it, or something like that. Your English names are so difficult. There was an island in the river, and an old church close by." "Twickenham, you mean Twickenham," he exclaimed. "Fancy your going so far on an omnibus. Your adventures, mademoiselle, must have been amusing." "Ah, yes, but poor madame, we did not return till 7 of the clock, and she was fearing something had happened." "Naturally," he said, "but let me give you a word of advice, mademoiselle. Be very careful where you go. London is not at all safe for a foreign lady like yourself, more especially if her face is as attractive as yours." "Oh," she laughed, "mine has no attraction, surely, and I tell you, monsieur, that I am not in the least afraid." He had expected her to be impressed by his flattery, but she was not. On the contrary, she passed his remark as though it had never been uttered, and continued to relate to him her impressions of London and London life, some of which were distinctly humorous, for the streets of our metropolis always strike the foreigner as full of quaint incongruities, from the balancing of the hansom cab to the kilt of the Highland soldier. He found her conversation amusing and interesting. She was somehow different from the wide circle of women of his acquaintance, those society dames who borrowed his money, ate his dinners, and gave tone to his entertainments, and this was exactly how she desired to impress him. As the weeks went on, the society swallows returned from wintering in the south, and the London season began in earnest. The millionaire, a frequent visitor at his sister's house, often met the pleasant-faced governess, who very cleverly succeeded in increasing her popularity until she was well known to Mrs. Fitzroy's lady friends, and declared by them all to be a perfect treasure. None knew, however, save little Bertha, who feared to speak lest mademoiselle should punish her, of a rather curious incident which occurred one morning as she was sitting with her charge in Kensington Gardens. A tall, dark-faced, middle-aged man with black moustache, well dressed in frock coat and silk hat, a fine diamond pin in his scarf, approached, raised his hat, uttered some mysterious words in Italian, and then took a seat at her side. At first, mademoiselle regarded the stranger with distrust, until he drew a paper from his pocket and allowed her to read it. Then, apparently satisfied, she listened to all he told her. But as it was in Italian, the child could not understand. She only noticed that mademoiselle turned rather pale, and seemed to be expressing deep regret. The dark-faced man spoke slowly and calmly, while on her part she shrugged her shoulders and showed her palms, and responded with quick volubility, while the child sat at her side, regarding the stranger in open-eyed wonder. Presently, after a long argument, the man took from his pocket a small tin box of matches, which he gave to her. Without examining it, she transferred it quickly to her coat pocket, and then, after a few parting words, the man rose, raised his hat, and strode away towards Queen's Gate, swinging his cane airily as he walked. "Who was that?" inquired the child, after he had gone. "What did he give you, mademoiselle?" "Nothing that concerns you, dearest," was her governess's reply. "Remember, you must say nothing of that monsieur, nothing, you recollect. You must never mention him to your mother or to anyone, because if you do I shall punish you very severely, and I shall never, never take you out with me again. You understand, eh?" The child's face fell, and her eyes were fixed straight before her as she answered, "Very well, mademoiselle, I won't say anything." "That's a good girl," her governess responded. "Some day you shall have a watch like your uncle's if you are very good," she added, for Bertha was very fond of watches, and especially of Morgan Mason's gold repeater. She liked to hear it chime upon its musical bell. One afternoon a few days later, Philomena watched from her window the millionaire descend from his motor and enter the house. First she hurried into the schoolroom where Bertha was sitting with the maid, and then she leisurely descended to the drawing-room where she found Mrs. Fitzroy and her brother talking together. "Oh, monsieur," laughed the governess, "Mademoiselle Bertha saw you arrive, and has sent me to ask a favour." "A favour!" he exclaimed. "Of course, I always grant the young lady's requests when she asks nicely. Mademoiselle wanted to know if you will let her hear your watch. Since you showed it to her a fortnight ago, she has allowed me no peace, so I promised I would come and ask of you." "Certainly," was the millionaire's reply, taking his repeater and the gold Albert from his pocket. "You know how to make it strike. I showed you the other day," he laughed as he handed it to her. "I will be very careful of it, monsieur, and will bring it back when mademoiselle is satisfied. She desires greatly one like it." "Some day I'll give her one when she's older," laughed Morgan Mason good-humouredly. And then, when the door had closed behind her, his sister remarked, "Mademoiselle is most devoted to Bertha, so very different to Miss Gardiner. She humours her in every way, and at the same time is a very good teacher. It is really wonderful how the child is improving." "I quite agree, Maud. She's an excellent girl, and I hope you pay her well. She deserves it." And then they fell to discussing plans for a big dinner party at the Carlton on the following Friday. Meanwhile, Mademoiselle ran upstairs with the watch in her hand, first to her own room, where she remained 5 minutes or so, and then took it to the schoolroom, where she delighted her little pupil by making the watch strike. "Make it go again, mademoiselle!" exclaimed little Bertha, delighted at being allowed to hold it in her hand. And again the governess pressed the ring and caused it to chime, until at last she was compelled to take it forcibly from the child's hand and carry it back again to the grey-whiskered man in the drawing-room, returning a word of thanks as she handed it back to him. That same evening, after her charge had been put to bed, and during Mrs. Fitzroy's absence at Lady Claridge's dance, she went out and dropped into the pillar-box at the corner of Grosvenor Square a small packet in a strong linen-lined envelope, addressed to Giuseppe Gallo, Esquire, care of H. Bird, newsagent, 386 Westminster Bridge Road, S.E. And then she returned to the little sitting-room set apart for her, and smiled confidently to herself as she settled to read the Tribuna, which her mother sent her regularly each day. A week later the household of Brook Street was thrown into a state of agitation and surprise when the vulgarian dashed round in a cab and informed his sister of a most audacious entry made by thieves into his splendid flat at Queen Anne's Mansions, and how they had turned it topsy-turvy. He had, it appeared, been absent, speaking for a parliamentary candidate up at Leicester, and his valet had slept in the flat alone, the other servants being on holiday, when during the night burglars had entered by a window from some leads adjoining, and had opened everything, even to his safe, and had apparently made a minute examination of every private paper he possessed. He had missed nothing except a few cigars, but what puzzled the detectives most was the manner in which safe, writing-table, and 2 chests of drawers, which he always kept locked, had been opened. Either the thieves possessed all the keys, and this did not appear possible, as they were all in the trusted valet's room, or else they possessed a master key to everything, the same as that which the Member of Parliament wore upon his watch chain. The millionaire was furious. He even spoke to the Home Secretary about it when he met him in the lobby of the House. But the manner in which the safe had been opened was a complete mystery, a mystery to all except to Mademoiselle. The vulgarian little suspected, when he so innocently lent his watch to his niece, that the handsome governess had taken an impression of wax of the small master key upon the other end of his chain, or that she had that very same evening posted the wax impression in the tin matchbox to the clever secret agent of the Italian War Office. The man, who with 2 colleagues had come over from Paris specially, who had met Mademoiselle in Kensington Gardens, and who was known at the newsagents in the Westminster Bridge Road as Giuseppe Gallo, a civil engineer seeking employment. End of section 33. Section 34 of Behind the Throne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. Behind the Throne by William le Queux. Section 34. Chapter 34. In Confidence. General Arturo Valentini, commanding the Italian forces on the Alpine frontier of France, sprang nimbly from an open cab and helped out his companion, a young lady in deep mourning with her long crape veil down, as is the custom in Italy. The sentries at the big arched gateway of the military prison of Turin, recognizing the commanding officer, stood at the salute, and in response the short, dapper little man in his uniform and a row of ribbons on his breast raised his hand to his peaked cap quickly in acknowledgment, and passed at once into the great bare courtyard surrounded by the high, white, inartistic outer offices of the prison. The soldiers off duty who were lounging and gossiping quickly drew themselves up to attention as he crossed the courtyard to the office of the governor, walking with his firm military gait and spurs clinking, and his sword trailing over the stones. He was one of the smartest and best soldiers Italy possessed, a man who had shown an iron nerve in those turbulent days of the struggle for unity, a man of rigid discipline and yet of kindly heart. The loss of his only son in the reverses in Abyssinia 2 years before had left him without kith or kin, and although he commanded a military district as large as England, and was also in possession of a private income, he led a simple life at his headquarters there in Turin, going into society as little as possible, and ever working to improve the condition of his command. His district was the most important of any in Italy, for in case of hostilities it would be the first point attacked, and as triumph usually lies with those who strike the first blow, it was his object to enter France effectively and on the instant, if the dogs of war were ever loose. With this end in view, he was untiring in his efforts to perfect the defences of those many valleys and alpine passes by which the enemy might gain admittance, if not perfectly secure. In both summer and winter his troops were ever manoeuvring in those high misty mountains, skirmishing, throwing bridges over the deep gorges, and executing evolutions always in secret, always fearing that the French might learn their intentions in case of war. That enormous army on the Italian frontier which one never sees, those regiments upon regiments which dwell far up in the remote heights of the Alps, away from the civilization of the towns, are kept a mystery by the Ministry of War. They are there, ever ready, one knows, but where all the hidden fortresses are situated, or where the death-dealing mines are laid, are secrets which only the War Office and the commander know. And it is those secrets which French spies are ever endeavouring to discover. Indeed, one of General Valentini's chief anxieties was the ingenuity displayed by the emissaries of France, who crossed the frontier in all kinds of disguises in the endeavour to learn the military secrets. Not a year went past but 2 or 3 of these spies were arrested and condemned, and be it said, the same state of things existed on French territory, where the Secret Service of Italy, the men from the bureau at headquarters there in Turin, boldly took their liberty in their hands and went forth to gain the secrets of their friends in the opposite valleys. It required an officer of clear foresight, great tact, and wide experience to control such a command, and in Arturo Valentini, the short, stout, red-faced little man, Italy certainly had one in whom she could repose the most absolute confidence. In the office of the prison governor the pair stood for a few minutes, until the dark-bearded, spectacled official entered, saluted the commander, invited both him and his companion to seats, and settled himself at his table. "I wish to have an interview with Felice Solaro," the general explained. "He is still here, I suppose?" "Until Thursday next, when he is to be transferred to Gorgona." "To Gorgona!" exclaimed the general in surprise, for the name of that lonely penal island in the Mediterranean, opposite Leghorn, was sufficient to cause him to shudder. "Then it is fortunate we came today," he added. "But," hesitated the grey-faced man, looking inquiringly at his company, "but of course this lady cannot see him. It is against the regulations, you know, General. No prisoner can be seen by anyone except yourself, save by order of the Minister of War." "I know," was the old officer's reply, "but this lady happens to be the daughter of the Minister Marini." Whereupon the governor bowed politely at the figure, whose face he could not well distinguish through her veil. "You therefore need have no hesitation in allowing the interview," added the general. "If you wish, I'll sign an order for it now." "No, certainly not. If the lady is the minister's daughter, it is of course different. But this fact is confidential, recollect. It must not appear in any report that she has visited here." The governor nodded. It was not the first time that ladies, high-born and well-dressed, some of them, had, on presenting orders from Camillo Morini, had interviews with officers and men undergoing imprisonment for various offences. Solaro's crime was, however, the most serious of that of any prisoner who had been incarcerated there since he had held the post of governor, the unpardonable crime of treason, of selling his country into the hands of its enemy. He only knew that the court-martial had found the charges proved, and therefore he was guilty. It surprised him that the daughter of the minister should wish to see the man condemned of such an offence, but he made no comment. He only touched his bell and gave instructions for the prisoner Solaro to be brought from his cell to the parlatorio. "You of course wish, General, to see the prisoner in private," remarked the governor, when the chief warder had gone. "If you please," responded the old officer in his sharp habit of speech. "Then I will not accompany you, but I may tell you that the prisoner has become much changed since his sentence. He declares his innocence and sits pondering all day in idleness." The general sighed without replying. They discussed the matter until the chief warder returned. They rose and followed him out across the courtyard, through a small iron-bound door, before which a sentry stood at the salute, into the inner courtyard of the prison itself, the small, dismal, bare stone place which formed the exercise yard, while all around were the small, barred, high-up windows of the cells. They passed through a door, and walking along a short corridor, entered a small room divided in half, by long iron bars from floor to ceiling, like the cage of some ferocious animal in captivity. Behind those bars stood the bent, pale-faced figure of Felice Solaro, different indeed from the straight, well-set-up man who had stood before the Minister of War and defiantly broken his sword across his knee. Dressed in an ill-made suit of coarse canvas, the beard he had grown gave him an unkempt and neglected appearance, the aspect of one in whom all hope was dead. On recognizing his visitors, he sprang forward to the bars. "Ah, my general," he cried, "how good of you to come to me!" And he put out his thin white hand through the iron cage to greet the man who had stood his friend and endeavoured to get his verdict reversed. Then, as the gallant old officer took his hand, he turned inquiringly towards the figure in black. She threw her long veil aside, and when he saw her face revealed, he gasped, "Signorina Mary, you have come here to see me?" Tears rose to her eyes and almost blinded her. Recollections of the past crowded upon her in that moment, and her heart was overburdened by pity for him. "The Signorina has done her best to induce her father to sign the order for your release, Captain. But alas," and the general sighed without concluding his sentence. "The minister refuses?" said the unfortunate man behind the bars. "And yet I tell you I am innocent, innocent." "I believe you are, Captain. If I did not, I should not interest myself on your behalf. But unfortunately, the powers in Rome are greater than mine. They are sending you out to Gorgona, it seems." "To Gorgona!" he gasped hoarsely, all the light dying from his pale, emaciated face. "Ah, then they mean to drive me mad by solitary confinement. My enemies have indeed triumphed." "But have courage, Felice," exclaimed Mary, speaking to him for the first time and taking his thin hand. "Surely one day you will have justice done to you. I cannot understand why my father so steadily refuses to release you." "Because he fears to do so," declared the condemned man. "I am victim of a foul intrigue in which that woman Philomena was one who conspired against me." "And yet you loved her," remarked the girl reproachfully. "Ah, I believe I did. I know that to you I ought not to mention her, Signorina, but forgive me. Do you recollect that night in Rome, at the ball at the Colonna Palace, when I asked you a question?" "I do," she responded, now very pale. "I was younger and did not know my own mind then. I thought I loved you. It was our flirtation that has brought you to this. I am to blame for everything." "No, no," he declared. "It is I who committed the indiscretion of falling in love with you when I knew that I, a poor captain, could never hope to marry the daughter of the Minister of War." She sighed, and tears welled again in her dark brown eyes. The general at her side was no woman's man, but even he became affected at this meeting. "They allege that you sold to France a copy of the mobilization scheme," she went on. "They say that I purposefully locked you in my father's library at Rome for 3 hours in order that you might have access to the secret documents which were in a drawer in his writing table." The prisoner, smiling bitterly, answered, "Let them allege whatever it pleases them. They cannot make my unjust punishment greater than it is. You yourself know that the charge is an unjust one, and my general knows that I would never betray Italy." "But to whom do you attribute this ingenious plot by which you have been made the scapegoat of someone else's offence?" asked Mary, looking straight into his deep sunken eyes. "That the plans of the Trecenta, as well as the copy of the mobilization scheme, have reached the French intelligence department is proved beyond doubt. Our secret service in Paris has ascertained that." "I have enemies, bitter ones," he answered in a strange tone, his eyes fixed upon her. "They fear me, and have taken this course in order to close my mouth, in order to prevent me making certain revelations that would effect their ruin." "But who are they?" she demanded. "The General has brought me here on purpose to put this question to you. If we are aware of all the facts, we may be able, after all, to rescue you from the horrors of Gorgona." The pale-faced man shook his unkempt head sorrowfully, his lips pressed together, his eyes upon hers. "No, you can never secure my release," he declared with despair. "They dare not give me my liberty for their own sakes. Jules Dubard and that Englishman, George MacBean, will take good care that I never come forth to denounce them." "George MacBean?" she gasped, open-mouthed, all the colour fading from her cheeks. "Do you know him? Is he actually one of those who is responsible for this?" For answer, the man behind the bars clenched his teeth and nodded in the affirmative. End of section 34. Section 35 of Behind the Throne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. Behind the Throne by William Le Queux. Section 35. Chapter 35. The Captain is Outspoken. "But tell me," cried Mary, utterly amazed at the unhappy man's startling allegations, "do you actually declare that Dubard and Mr. MacBean have conspired in order to throw the opprobrium upon you?" "I do," he answered in a low, hard tone. "I am convinced of it. MacBean is an Englishman living in London, secretary to a deputy named Morgan Mason." "He is a friend of mine," she remarked quietly. "I know him quite well." "Then do not trust him," Solaro urged. "He is the—" But he hesitated, as though fearing to make any direct charge against one who was her friend. "The what?" she inquired eagerly. For a few moments he remained silent. "He is the man who, with Dubard, was the cause of my downfall," he responded, although from his hesitating tone she felt assured that those words were not what he had first intended to utter. "And Dubard?" she asked, her face now very grave. "What use is it to discuss either of them?" he said bitterly. "I am their victim. That is all." "But with what motive?" she asked, bewildered at this revelation. "What connection can Mr. MacBean possibly have with these false, scandalous charges against you?" "Ah, the motive is more than I can tell," he declared. "I can only surmise it." "But there surely must be some motive," she remarked, at the same time recollecting what she had learnt, that the information furnished by Dubard formed the basis of the charges intended to be levelled by the Socialists against her father. "I have never had an opportunity of ascertaining it," he said. "I would, however, desire to warn you most strongly against that man MacBean." Mary remained silent. What he had said puzzled and mystified her. His words were not prompted by motives of jealousy. That was impossible, for he was unaware of MacBean's presence in Rome. As far as she knew, the two men had never been acquainted, the one an officer in garrison in the Alps, and the other living in far-off London. She endeavoured to induce him to speak more plainly, but it was evident that her acknowledgment that MacBean was her friend prevented him from opening his mind concerning him. All her sympathies being with the imprisoned man, she felt a distinct suspicion arising within her concerning the young Englishman. She wondered whether after all he had really schemed to obtain an appointment in the ministry, if his present position was only in furtherance of some sinister object. She spoke of Dubard, but the prisoner was equally silent concerning him. "What I can tell you about either of them amounts to nothing without proof, and without my liberty I cannot obtain that. They know it," he said angrily. "They know that while I am here in prison my lips are sealed." "But it is infamous," exclaimed the red-faced old general. "If you were the victim of a plot laid by these two fellows, whoever they are, the matter ought to be sifted to the bottom. I don't believe you are guilty, Solaro. I told His Excellency the Minister so." "Ah, my dear General, you have been my best friend," declared the man, now clothed in sacking in lieu of a uniform, "but your efforts must all be unavailing. They are sending me to the loneliness of Gorgona, that place where many a better man than myself has been driven insane by solitude. They know that on Gorgona I shall not live very long. Indeed, they will take very good care of that." "They? Who are they?" inquired Mary quickly. "My enemies." "Mr. Macbean and Dubard, you mean?" "No, others. I need not name," he responded vaguely, with a careless shrug of his shoulders. "But if you are the victim of a plot, it must have been a most elaborate one, for the mass of evidence against you seems overwhelming. What object could the conspirators have had in view? Were they friends of yours?" "Yes. Once their object was probably not of their own, but that of others," he added. His words left the impression upon her that his conviction was part of the elaborate scheme of Angelo Borselli, and yet was not that very man now urging her to secure his release. The affair was increased in mystery 1,000-fold. "Then if Mr. Macbean was only slightly known to you, why should he have plotted to secure your ruin and imprisonment?" she queried in eagerness. "As I have already said, they were both in peril as long as I was at liberty. It was to their own interests, indeed for their own safety, that I should be sent here." "What do they fear?" "They fear what I could reveal, the facts that I could prove, if I were not held here a prisoner," he said bitterly. "And would those facts be strange ones?" "They would be startling. They would create a sensation throughout Italy. They would throw a new light on certain affairs connected with the Ministry of War that would come as a thunderclap upon the people." "You defied the minister, remember?" his general remarked gravely. "I know. I lost my head. I broke my sword and threw the pieces at his feet in defiance. I was foolish, very foolish. Only I was angry at his refusal to order a revision of my trial." "Yes," the general admitted, "you have prejudiced yourself in His Excellency's eyes, I fear. Your indignation was but natural, but it was ill-advised at that moment. The Minister Marini is not the man to brook defiance in that manner." "But I do defy him still," cried the desperate man, turning to the tragic figure in black. "Although he is your father, Signorina, I repeat that he has done me an injustice, and that injustice is because he, like the others, fears to give me my liberty. But if you were released, if I could manage to obtain for you a pardon, would you make the revelations of which you have spoken?" For some minutes he was silent, thinking deeply, apparently reflecting upon the consequences of speaking the truth. Then he answered, "No, I think not." "Why not?" Because there are one or two facts of which I have no absolute proof." "But you are certain of Dubard's connection with the false charges against you?" "Positive. He arranged with Filomena Nodari for my betrayal." "But why? I cannot see the motive, and yet he must have had one." "In his own interests as well as those of the Englishmen." "You mean Macbean?" "Yes, the betrayer." Mary's heart beat quickly. She could not grasp his meaning, yet he refused to tell her plainly the whole of the strange circumstances, apparently fearing to give her pain because she had declared herself to be a friend of the Englishman. He was, of course, in ignorance of their friendship, just as he was in ignorance of her engagement to Jules Dubard. She was in a dilemma absolute and complete. What Borselli had declared, namely, that the unfortunate captain was in possession of some facts, which he would prove if he regained his liberty, seemed to be the truth. Yet if she secured his liberty by pressing her father to pardon him, she would only be deliberately giving to his political enemies a weapon whereby they might hound him from office, while further he refused to make her a direct promise to tell the truth or make the revelations, even if liberated. What could she do? How could she act? His allegations held her amazed, speechless. He had declared himself to be the victim of the ingenious conspiracy formed by the Frenchman and by George Macbean, the latter of all men. The whole affair was an enigma that was inexplicable. That Macbean had entered into a plot against him was utterly beyond her comprehension. He was essentially a Londoner, and had surely no interest whatsoever in the Alpine defences of Italy. Dubard was certainly his friend. Had he not indeed told her so? He had, only a fortnight before, expressed a hope that Dubard would soon return from the Pyrenees. And yet that broken, desperate man, the man with whom she had had that pleasant flirtation during one Roman season, had fallen their victim. But if so, why was Borselli now anxious that he should be freed, in order to make his revelations against the very man Dubard, who was his intimate friend, the man who, it was said, had furnished the opposition with facts, most of them false, regarding her father's political shortcomings? She tried to reason it all out, but became the more and more utterly bewildered. The reason of the captain's denunciation of George Macbean was a mystery. When he mentioned the Englishman's name, she had noticed a flash in his deep-set eyes, betokening a deadly, deep-rooted hatred. And yet it was upon this very man that all her thoughts and reflections had of late been centred. As they were alone in that grim, gloomy room with its barred partition, the governor having granted them a private conference, she explained how the socialists had endeavoured to make capital out of the charges against him, with a view to obtaining her father's dismissal from office. She made no mention of her compact with Dubard, or her engagement to him, but merely explained how, at the 11th hour, while Monte Bruno was on his feet in the Chamber of Deputies, the mysterious note had been placed in his hand, which had had the effect of arresting the charges he was about to pour forth. Solaro listened to her in silence while she gave a description of the scene in the chamber, and related certain details of the conspiracy which she had learned through her father, the details gathered in secret by Vito Ricci. "Ah," he sighed at last, having listened open-mouthed, "it is exactly as I expected. Your father's enemies are mine. Having drawn me safely into their net, they intend to use my condemnation as proof of the insecurity of the frontier and the culpability of the Minister of War." "But if they attack the minister, they must attack me personally," exclaimed the general in surprise, for he had been in ignorance of the widespread intrigue to hold the Ministry of War up to public ridicule and condemnation. "As the frontier is under my command, I am personally responsible for its security." "Exactly," Solaro said in a somewhat quieter tone. "If His Excellency had ordered a revision of my trial, I should most certainly have been proved innocent, and that being so, the Socialists would have had no direct charge which they could level against the ministry. But as it is, I stand here condemned, imprisoned as a traitor, and therefore my general is culpable, and above him the minister himself." "My father should have pardoned you long ago. It is infamous," Mary declared with rising anger. "By refusing your appeal for a new trial, he placed himself in this position of peril." "Had I been released, I would have given into his hands certain information by which he could have crushed the infamous intrigue against him," said the man behind the bars in a low, desperate tone. "But now it is too late for a revision of my sentence. Our enemies have triumphed. I am to be sent to Gorgona, sent to my death. while the plot against His Excellency still exists, and the coup will be made against him at the very moment when he feels himself the most secure." Then, watching the pale face, he added suddenly, "Forgive me, Signorina, for speaking frankly like this. He is, I recollect, your father, but he has done me a grave injustice. He could have saved me, saved himself, if he had cared to do so." "But you have said that my father fears to give you your liberty," she remarked. "If that is so, it is fear and not disinclination that has prevented him granting you a pardon." "It is both," he declared hoarsely. "But is there no one else who could assist you, who would expose these enemies and their plot?" she asked. "No one," he answered. "The most elaborate preparations were made to set the trap into which I unfortunately fell. I was watched in Paris, in Bologna, in Turin, in garrison and out of it. My every movement was noted, in order that it might be misconstrued. That Frenchman who struck up an acquaintance with me in Paris, and who afterwards lent me money, was in the pay of my enemies, and from that all the damning evidence against me was constructed with an ingenuity that was fiendish. I, an innocent man, was condemned without being given any opportunity of proving my defence. Ask Dubard or the Englishmen, ask them to tell the truth, if they dare." "But tell me more of Mr. McBean," she cried eagerly. "Why do you allege against him?" "I make no allegations," he answered in a low, changed voice. "I can suffer in silence. Only when you meet that man, tell him that Felice Solaro, from his prison, sends him his warmest remembrances. Then watch his face. That is all. His countenance will tell you the truth." End of section 35.
Chapter 36 of Behind the Throne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Behind the Throne by William LeQue. Chapter 36. In the Twilight Hour. For Mary Morini, the world was full of base intrigue and uncharitableness, of untruth and false friendship. 4 years ago she had returned to Italy from that quiet school at Broadstairs to find herself plunged suddenly into a circle of society, torn by all the conflicting failings of the human heart. The world which she had believed to be so full of beauty was only a wild, stormy waste, whereon each traveller was compelled to fight in battle for reputation and for life. Already world-weary before her time, she was nauseated by the hollow shams about her, tired of the glare of those gilded salons, and appalled by the intrigues on every hand. The intrigues which had for their object her father's ruin and the sacrifice of all her love, her youth, and happiness. Often she asked herself if there could be any element of good remaining in such a world as hers. She tried it by the test of her religious principle, and found it selfish, indolent, and vain, attracting and swallowing up all who lived within the sphere of its contaminating influence. She had believed herself adapted to the exercise of her affections, that she might love and trust and hope to the utmost of her wishes. But, alas, hers had been a rude awakening, and the stern realities of life were to her a cruel and bitter revelation. In her Christian meekness, she constantly sought divine guidance, even though compelled to live amid that gay whirl of Rome, for the date of her marriage was rapidly approaching, the day when the man to whom she had bartered herself in exchange for her father's life would come forward and claim her. The reason, as society knew it, was far advanced, and although her mind was filled by those grave suspicions conjured up by Solaro's allegations, she frequently met and talked with George MacBean. His duties as her father's secretary took him to the palace a great deal, and sometimes of an evening they met at various official functions to which the young Englishman had also been bidden. Out of the very poverty and the feebleness of her life, out of sheer desperation, she became drawn towards him, and the bond of friendship became still more closely cemented, even though those suspicions ever arose within her. He was Dubbard's friend. He had admitted that to her, and as Dubbard's friend, she mistrusted him. She had no friend in whom she could confide, or of whom she might ask advice. She exchanged few such confidences with her mother, while she was unable to reveal to her father her secret visit to Solaro's prison for fear of his displeasure. It was at this crisis of her young life that she felt the absolute want of a participator in her joys, a recipient of her secrets, and a soother of her sorrows. And it was this sense of utter loneliness which rendered the young Englishman's society so welcome to her. Weeks had passed since her painful interview with poor Solaro. The dull burden of accumulated sorrows hung heavily upon her. She had begun afresh. She had made a fresh dedication of her heart to God. She had commenced her patient work of unraveling the mystery of the great intrigue by which to save her father, and to escape herself from the fate to which he was consigned. She had commenced the work as though it had never been undertaken before, supported by Christian faith, and ever striving not to prejudge the man whose friendship had now become so necessary to her existence. What the unfortunate prisoner had told her, however, had opened her eyes to many plain facts, the chief of them being that Borselli had, by his suggestion that she should secure the captain's release, endeavored to induce her to bring ruin upon her own father. For the minister to sign a decree of pardon now was impossible. Such an action must inevitably cause his downfall. Therefore it was necessary that the captain should remain in prison, although innocent. In Rome, a sudden tranquillity had fallen upon the face of that ever-changing political world around the throne. Mary, who was seen at every ball and at every official dinner, still retained her golden and exuberant youth, her joyous step, her sweet smile, and the world believed her very happy. She was to marry Jules Dubbard. But at home, in the hours of loneliness in her own room, there fell upon her the grim tragedy of it all, and she shed tears, bitter tears, because she was still fettered, still unable to discover the truth. 2 years ago she had possessed all the freshness of unwearied nature, the glow of the health, that life spring of all the energies of thought and action, the power to believe as well as to hope, the earnestness of zeal, unchilled by disappointment, the first awakening of joy, the clear perception of a mind unbiased in its search of truth, the fervor of an untroubled soul. But alas, the world had now disappointed her. Like Phyllis Solaro, like her father, she too had fallen a victim of those unscrupulous persons whose base craft and low cunning were alike mysterious and unfathomable. George Macbean, watching her as closely as he did, realized the gradual change in her, and was much puzzled. True, she wore the same magnificent Paris-made gowns, was as humorous and irresponsible, and laughed as gaily as she had done in those summer days in England. Yet sometimes, as they sat alone, he detected that burden of grief and sadness that oppressed her mind. She soon was to marry Dubbard, yet her attitude was by no means that of the self-satisfied bride. Ignorant of the bitter reflections within her, he was, of course, much mystified at those gloomy, despairing words that sometimes involuntarily fell from her lips. He did not know, as she so vividly realized, that the day she married Jules Dubbard, her beloved father would again be at the mercy of those who sought his downfall. Her Excellency had suggested a visit to Paris for the trousseau, but this she had declined. She had no desire for the gaiety which a visit to the French capital would entail. Therefore, all the dresses and lingerie were being made in Florence and Rome, a magnificent trousseau, which a princess of the blood, might have envied, for Camillo Morini never spared any expense where his daughter was concerned. Yet she scarcely looked at the rich and costly things as they arrived in huge boxfuls, but ordered Teresa to put them aside, sighing within herself that the world was so soon to make merry over the great tragedy of her life. Dubbard was still at Bayonne, detained on business connected with his estate. He wrote frequently, and, much against her own inclination, she was compelled to reply to his letters. More than one person, her own set, remarked upon the prolonged absence of the popular young Frenchman who had become so well known in the Eternal City, but only one person guessed the true reason, and that person was George McBean. Late one afternoon she had been driving on the Pincio, as was her habit each day. She was alone, her mother being too unwell to go out, and just as the passeggetta, or fashionable promenade, was over, she passed the young Englishman walking alone. She bowed and drove on, but presently stopped her Victoria, alighted, and telling the coachman that she would walk home, dismissed him. Most of the carriages had already left that beautiful hill garden, from the terraces of which one obtains such wonderful panoramas of the ancient city, and it being nearly 6 o'clock, the promenaders were now mostly cookkites, the women bloused and tweed-skirted, and the men in various costumes of England, from the inevitable blue serge suit to the breeches and golf cap of the seaside, people with whom she was unacquainted. In a few moments they met, and he turned happily and walked in her direction. "I'm cramped," she declared. "I've been in the carriage nearly 3 mortal hours, first paying calls with father, and then here alone. I saw you, so it was a good opportunity of getting a walk. You go to the Princess Palmieri's tonight, I suppose?" "Yes, Her Highness has sent me a card," he answered. "Thanks to your father, I suppose." As she walked beside him, in a beautiful gown of pale dove gray with a large black hat, he glanced at her admiringly and added, "I saw in today's Tribuna that the Count is expected back in 2 or 3 days. Have you had news of him?" "I received a letter yesterday from Biarritz. He is with his aunt, who is very unwell and is paying a dutiful visit before coming here." In silence they walked on, passing the water clock, and descending the hill until they came to that small piazza with the stone balustrade that affords such a magnificent vista of the ancient city. Here they halted to enjoy the view, as the tourists were enjoying it. The wonderful Eternal City, with its 100 towers, lay below them in the calm golden mist of evening. It was a scene she had looked upon hundreds of times, yet at the moment she was attracted by the crowd of personally conducted, who stood at the stone balustrade and gazed away in the direction of where the huge dome of St. Peter's loomed up through the haze. Like many a cosmopolitan, she took a mischievous delight in mingling with a crowd of English tourists and hearing their comments upon things Italian, remarks that were often dryly humorous. She stood at her companion's side, chatting with him while the light faded, the glorious afterglow died away, and the tourists, recollecting the hour of their respective tables d'hôte, descended the hill to the city. And then, when they were alone, he turned to her and, with a touch of bitterness in his voice, said, "I suppose very soon you will leave Rome and live in Paris. Has the Count made any plans?" "We live this summer at the chateau," was her answer. "The winter he intends to spend on the Riviera." "And Rome will lose you," he exclaimed in regret. "At the Countess Bardi's last night they were discussing it, and everyone expressed sorrow that you should leave them." She sighed deeply, and in her eyes he thought he detected the light of tears. "For many things I shall really not be sorry to leave Rome," she answered blankly. "Only I wish I were going to live in dear old England. I have no love for Paris, and the artificiality of the Riviera I detest. It is the plague spot of Europe, What people can really see in it beyond the attraction of gambling, I never can understand. The very atmosphere is hateful to anyone with a spark of self-respect. They were leaning on the old gray stonework, their faces turned to the darkening valley where wound the Tiber, the center of the civilization of all the ages, the great misty void wherein the lights were already beginning to twinkle. Furtively he glanced at her countenance, and saw upon her white brow a look of deep, resigned despair. He loved her. This beautiful woman was to sacrifice herself to the man who he knew had entrapped her, and yet whom he dare not denounce for fear of incriminating himself. He, who worshipped her, who loved her in truth and in silence, as no man had ever loved a woman, was compelled to stand by and witness the tragedy. Night after night, when he thought of it as he paced his room, he clenched his hands in sheer despair and cried to himself in agony. Debard was to be her husband, Jules Debard, the man who, knowing of his presence in Rome, feared to return to claim her as his wife. "You are very silent, Miss Mary," he managed to say at last, watching her pale, beautiful face set away towards the dark valley. "I was thinking," she answered, turning slowly, facing him and looking straight into his eyes. "Of what? Shall I tell you frankly?" "Certainly," he said, smiling. "You were always frank with me, are you not?" "Well, I was thinking of a man who was once my friend, a man whom I believe you have cause to remember," she replied in a meaning tone. "A man named Felix Solaro." "Felix Solaro?" he gasped, quickly starting back, his cheeks blanching as he repeated the name. "If Felix Solaro is a friend of yours, Miss Mary, then he has probably told you the truth. The ghastly truth," he cried hoarsely as his face fell. "He has revealed to you the mystery concerning General Sazerac. Tell me, what allegation has he made against me?" End of chapter 36. Read by Elijah Fisher. Chapter 37 of Behind the Throne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Behind the Throne by William LeQueux. Chapter 37. At Orton Court Again. George MacBean stood at the window of the rector's little study at Thornby, gazing out across the level lawn. Outside the typical old-fashioned English garden, bright in the June sunlight, was a wealth of flowers, while the old house itself was embowered in honeysuckle and roses. Beyond the tall box hedge stood the ancient church tower, square and covered with ivy, round which the rocks were lazily circling against the blue and cloudless sky. Through the open diamond-paned window came the fragrant perfume of the flowers, with a breath of that open English air that was to him refreshing after the dust and turmoil of the eternal city. "Getting tired of being a cosmopolitan, eh?" laughed the big, good-humored man, turning to him. "I thought you would." "No, I'm not altogether tired," he answered, "but a change is beneficial to us all, you know. I suppose my wire surprised you?" "Yes, and no. Of course I had 3 weeks ago that the Morinis were returning to Orton for the wedding, and I naturally expected you to put in appearance. What a lucky dog you are, to have got such an appointment. And yet you grumble at your bread and cheese. Look at me. 2 sermons, Sunday school, religious instruction, mother's meeting, coal club, same thing each week, year in, year out. And can't afford to do the swagger and keep a curate. I never get the chance, except now, and then a day with the hounds or a dinner from some charitably disposed person. But what about the marriage? We all thought it was to be in Italy. He's French, and she's Italian, so to be married in England, they must have no end of formalities." Mary is a Protestant, remember, and a cabinet minister can do anything. So they are to be married in Orton Church," he added in a strange undertone. His eyes turned towards the sunlit lawn, over which old Hayes, the groom gardener, was running the machine. "I ought to have called to congratulate her. But, as you know, I only returned last night from doing duty over at I ought to drive over after tea. Is the Count there?" "No. When we left Rome, I came straight to London on some urgent private business of His Excellency's, and they remained a week in Paris, where Dubbard was, to complete the trousseau, I suppose." "It is one of Mary's whims to be married by special license by the canon at Orton, I've heard. Is that so?" asked Sinclair. The young man nodded. He had no desire to discuss the tragedy, for he knew well that the marriage was a loveless one, and although his own affection had been outspoken, he was beside himself with grief and despair. He who knew the truth, yet dare not utter one single word to save her. For 10 days he had been in London, staying at his old chambers with Billy Grenfell, and transacting business at the Italian Consulate General, connected with the formalities of the marriage, formalities which were expected because his employer was Minister of War, paragraphs, and crept into the press. The ladies' papers had published Mary's portrait, and the marriage, because it was to take place in a village church, was called a romantic one. George McBean smiled bitterly when he recollected how much more of tragedy than romance there was in it. He adored her. For months her face had been the very sun of his existence, and in those recent weeks they had become so closely associated that even her mother had looked somewhat askance at the secretary's attentions, to which she had seemed in no way averse. A bond of sincerest sympathy had drawn them together. She was in no way given to flirtation, not even her bitterest enemies. Those jealous women who were always ready to create scandal and invent untruths about her could charge her with that. No. She had accepted George's warm, platonic friendship in the spirit it was given, at the same time ever struggling to stifle down that strange and startling allegation which Felix Solaro had made against him. The very world seemed united against her. For even in George McBean, the man whom she had believed to be the ideal of honesty and uprightness, she dared not put her absolute trust. "The court is full of visitors," George remarked a few minutes later, "so I thought I'd come here and stay. I can drive over there every day. Next week we go back to Rome again for another month, and then His Excellency returns on leave to England." "You're cultivating quite an official air, my dear boy," exclaimed the rector, refilling his pipe, and glad to change the subject of the conversation. "Your letters to me, headed Ministry of War, 1st Division, are most imposing documents. I'd like to have a trot round Rome with you. I've never been farther than Boulogne. 7 and 6 worth of seasickness from Folkestone, and I don't think much of foreign parts, if that's a specimen of them." McBean smiled at his uncle's bluff remarks, and then fell to give him some description of the minister's palace in Rome, and of his position in the society of the Eternal City. After early tea, Hayes brought round the trap, and the two men drove over to Court Orton, where, on entering, there were signs everywhere for the coming event, which, now that it was known who Camillo Morini really was, created much excitement throughout the countryside. The decision that the marriage should take place in England had been quite a sudden one, but, curiously enough, it had been at Dubbard's own instigation. George had gathered that fact, and it held him mystified. The bridegroom had some hidden reason in making that suggestion. The instant the rector saw Mary, he recognized what a change had taken place in her. Within himself, he asked whether it was due to the secret that his nephew had confessed to him. Standing in the long, old-fashioned drawing-room, with its big bowls of roses, he apologized for not calling earlier and congratulated her, whereupon she responded in a quiet, inert voice, "It is very kind of you, Mr. Sinclair, very kind indeed. I don't know if you had a card. It has all been done in such a rush, but you will come on Thursday, won't you?" He accepted with pleasure, and glancing at his nephew, saw that the young man's face told its own sad tale. "Has not the Count arrived?" asked MacBean of her. "No, I had a wire this morning. He leaves Paris tonight, so he'll be here after luncheon tomorrow." Leaving Sinclair with Mary, George went along to the study, where he found the minister busy with some important dispatches which had just arrived by special messenger from the Italian embassy in London. Therefore he was compelled to seat himself at the table opposite and assist his chief. So long did the correspondence take that the rector and his nephew were invited to remain to dine informally, George being placed, to his great delight, next the unhappy woman whom he so dearly loved. It was the last time he would dine with her. He told himself during the meal, and through his brain crowded memories of those happy hours spent at her side amid the brilliant glitter of the salons in Rome, when, although hundreds were around him, he had only eyes for her, and her alone. And he, by that relentless fate that held him silent, was compelled to stand by and watch her noble self-sacrifice. End of chapter 37. Read by Elijah Fisher.
Chapter 38 of Behind the Throne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ruth Sutherland. Behind the Throne by William Le Queux. Chapter 38. Silence for Silence. On the following night, as 11 o'clock slowly chimed from the pointed steeple of Orton Church, George MacBean was walking along the narrow path that led from the high road to Rugby, first across the wide cornfields and then through the small dark wood until he reached the river bank. Here he halted at a low stile which barred the path and waited. Before him ran the river, grey and placid beneath the clouded moon. Behind him, the pitch darkness of the covert where hounds were always certain of finding a fox or two in the course of the season. The cry of a night bird, the rustling of a rat among the rushes, and the distant howl of a dog up at the village were the only sounds that broke the quiet. Not a breath of wind ruffled the surface of the deep stream. Not a leaf was stirred until of a sudden there came the sound of footsteps, and the dark figure of a man loomed up against the misty grey. "Eh bien?" inquired the man in French as he approached, for the newcomer was none other than Jules Dubard. He was staying at a hotel in Rugby, and they had met that afternoon under Marini's roof, greatly to the Frenchman's surprise. But he had managed to conceal his chagrin, to greet the secretary so that none should suspect the truth, and now, at MacBean's suggestion, had come forth to meet him alone. The pair were once again face to face. "And well?" George asked, speaking in the same language the Frenchman had used. "It is I who should demand the reason of your presence here, monsieur." "Ah, my dear friend," replied the other, "this is a meeting very fortunate for me, for it enables me to say something which I have long wanted to say." "I have no wish to hear you. I only demand the reason you are here,
a guest in the minister's house. You surely know, he laughed airily. Am I not to marry Mademoiselle Marie? You have schemed to do so, I know. Well, well, he remarked philosophically, we are both schemers, are we not, my dear George? In scheming, however, so very little is certain. But in this world one thing is certain, namely, that Mademoiselle Marie will become Comtesse du Bard at 3 o'clock on the day after tomorrow. The two men were standing quite close to each other, and in that grey light could readily watch the expression of each other's faces. It is your intention, no doubt, answered Macbean. But during the month I have been in Rome, I have not been idle. I have learned how Angelo Borselli still holds you in the hollow of his hand, and how cleverly he has made you his cat's paw to ruin and disgrace Marini. Listen, and if I speak an untruth, deny it. Ever since the Sazerac affair, you and Borselli have actively conspired against Camillo Marini. The Undersecretary, with your assistance, had arranged a political coup, but in order to compel Miss Mary to give her consent to this scandalous marriage, you have induced Borselli to stay his hand. You are forcing her to marry you in order to save her father from ruin and probably from suicide, well knowing, however, what Borselli's intentions are. As soon as she is your wife and you have obtained her dot, you intend— Look here, hound, did you ask me to come here to insult me? Cried the Frenchman in fury, advancing a pace in a threatening manner. You have said you have something to say to me, was his response, but before you say it, I wish to make plain what are my intentions. And what are they, pray? I intend to prevent Mary Marini making this sacrifice, was his quiet, determined reply. You love her yourself. Friends of mine have watched you in Rome. Although I was absent, I knew quite well that you were in her father's service. But believe me, I was in no manner anxious, first because of your menial position, a mere secretary, and secondly because of the past. The past, cried Macbean, the past! Surely you ought not to speak of the past. You, to whom the family of Marini, the father of the innocent woman you have schemed to marry, owes the peril in which he now exists. You shall never marry her, he added angrily. Never. There was a brief silence. Then Du Bard responded with a defiant laugh. You cannot prevent it, my friend. But I will. And expose yourself? I shall at least expose a man who has marked down a pure and innocent woman as his victim. Du Bard laughed again, saying, Of course, you've fallen in love with her, and are jealous that she should become my wife. I am her friend, he declared, and I will protect her. And allow the charges to be made against her father? They will be brought whether you marry her or not. You know that quite well. I have not been private secretary to Marini without discovering the insecurity of his official position and the deadly rivalry and crafty cunning of Angelo Borselli. Again, answer me one question. Why is Felice Solaro, your friend, condemned as a traitor? He doesn't concern me in the least, was the other's reply. But the matter concerns me, Macbean went on. Recollect how studiously you have avoided me ever since August, when I recognized you driving over in that road yonder, when an evil fate threw me again across your path. You appear, then, to believe that I am in fear of you, he said, but let me tell you that I have no such anxiety whatsoever. Try and prevent my marriage, but recollect it will be at your own peril. George knew well at what his enemy had hinted. He knew too well that if he uttered one word it would bring upon him a deadly peril, that he would be hurled to ruin and disgrace. Nevertheless, he was determined to sacrifice himself rather than all that he held most dear should be snatched away from him by that man whose very existence and position was an adventure and a fraud. But seeing the Frenchman determinedly, he said, The reason I invited you out here was to tell you frankly my intention, and so allow you opportunity to leave the place before the truth is known. I intend to go tomorrow to the minister and tell him exactly the true state of affairs. He is in utter ignorance that it was you who stayed the adverse tide against him in the Chamber of Deputies, in ignorance that you made that vile, despicable agreement with his poor, unfortunate daughter. When I have spoken, we shall see whether he will allow the marriage to take place. And when you have spoken, we shall also see whether he will not hear my own story. I am prepared for any allegation you may make against me, responded George. You may ruin me, you may do what you and your friends will, but you shall never marry Mary Marini. I defy you. Very well, we shall see. Tell the minister what you choose, but remember that if you endeavour to create friction between us, I will show you no mercy. He cried between his teeth. Until now I have been silent, but... You've been silent because you know too well that you fear to speak. You fear to make any allegations against me. I know rather too much, declared the Englishman with confidence. Much or little, it does not concern me in the least, replied the foreigner. You create unpleasantness, and eh bien, I do the same. Then you actually intend that that desperate woman, in deadly fear of her father's ruin, shall become your wife? I do. Then I tell you, Dubard, he cried, that I will not allow it. I will never allow it. I will tell the truth and bear the consequences. The consequences, exclaimed the Frenchman in a deep, serious voice, his teeth hard set in anger, which he strove to suppress, but which nevertheless rose by reason of his quick foreign nature. The consequences? Have you realized them all? You seem to have a short memory, my dear friend, and a short memory is often convenient. Shall I refresh it for you? He asked, as the man before him clutched at the wooden rail of the stile for support, although striving valiantly to preserve a defiant calm. Shall I recall to you the memory of those sunny winter days when your employer, Morgan Mason, took you with him to the Villa Puget at Mentone, when he was the guest of his brother-in-law, General Felix Sazerac? I know, cried the young Englishman. I know all. Why should you recall all that? To refresh your memory, my dear friend, responded Dubard with withering sarcasm. Do you recollect how that we were friends in those days, you, Felice, Solaro, and myself? Solaro and I were at the Hotel National, and you were given a room at the villa by your employer's hostess, his elder sister, Madame Sazerac, who had married the general. Do you not remember these days spent at Monte Carlo or up at lhoughton, our luncheons, our dinners at the Paris, and our little games at the tables? Oh yes, you had a merry time then. We all had, even the poor general himself. And then... Stop, Macbean implored, raising both his hands. Enough, I know. Heavens, as though I could ever forget. But you have forgotten, it seems, or you, of all persons, would never seek to come between me and the woman I am to marry. Therefore hear me once and for all, and when you have heard, reflect well before you adopt a course which must inevitably reflect upon yourself, nay more, which must cause your own ruin. Do you recollect how your employer, Morgan Mason, had gone alone to Marseille to meet his Indian manager, who was returning to England, and how you, being alone, the general often invited you to ride with him up the Corniche road and sometimes into the mountains? He was fond of the English because his wife was English, and he had taken a great fancy to you. Being in command of the Alpine frontier defences in France, he had often to make inspections of those high-up fortresses that guard the passes into Italy, and one day he invited you to ride with him away up to the fortress of Saint-Martin-Lantos that overlooks Monte Malto. I will not hear you, cried Macbean hoarsely. Enough, enough. But the Frenchman continued in the same quiet, hard, meaning tone, his voice sounding clear in the quiet of night. With Solaro I chanced to call at the villa just as your horses were brought round, and we stood upon the steps and saw you mount. You waved your hand triumphantly to us, and trotted away at the side of the man who held the southeast frontier of France under his command. Do you recollect, as you rode down the drive bordered by its flowering azaleas, how you turned and looked back at us, in wonder whether we suspected your intentions. Perhaps not. The truth remains the same, he added, his face now closer to that of the man against whom he was making that withering accusation. You rode nearly 20 miles into the mountains and were high up above the Vesubie, in a wild, solitary district devoid of any human habitation, when, it being hot, you offered your brandy flask to the general, who was without one, for you yourself had surreptitiously taken it from his holster prior to setting out. Being thirsty, he took a long drink. Half an hour later he felt ill and dismounted, and in an hour the poor fellow was dead. George MacBean stood still, gripping the moss-grown rail, glaring at his accuser, though no word escaped his lips. The cognac you gave to the general was never suspected by the doctors, who declared the fatality to be due to an internal malady from which he had long suffered, and which was known might cause sudden death. The gallant officer was buried with military honours in Nice, and none were aware of the truth save Solaro and I. We knew that a sum of money which the general had upon him had been stolen, and further that the brandy you had given him you had not dared to drink yourself. In secret we charged you with the general's murder for the sake of the money upon him, but you defied us and made a gallant fight to brave it out. But it was useless. Solaro declared that you had concealed the money, whereupon you offered to allow us to search your possessions, and we found a draft on the Credit Lyonnaise in the flap of your writing case. You offered to allow us to seal, before your eyes, the brandy in the bottle in your room, together with that remaining in your flask, and we sent it to be analysed by an analyst in Paris, whom you yourself named. You hoped to mislead us, to disarm our suspicions, by allowing us to make all the inquiries we, as friends of the general, thought fit. Ah, that was a fatal mistake, my friend. You condemned yourself. The analyst's report does not lie. I still have it here in my pocket-book, and you know what it says? It states that the contents of both bottle and the flask filled from it were submitted to the tests of Marsh, Reinsch, and Fresenius, and in each case the result was the same. The cognac contains sufficient of a specific irritant poison of an arsenical nature to render a single mouthful of it a fatal dose. This document, he added, touching his breast pocket as he spoke, proves you to be the murderer of Felix Zazarak. You poisoned him deliberately when up alone in that mountain pass, and Solaro found in your effects part of the money you stole from the dead man's pockets. MacBean tried to speak, but his throat contracted. He was unable. Alas, that terrible truth had been ever before him since that fatal day in spring, when his life had been fettered. Try how he would, he could not put from him the horror of those awful hours. There were, unfortunately, witnesses against him, witnesses who could prove his guilt and send him to an assassin's punishment. Well, he managed to gasp at last in a low, half-frightened voice, his heart beating quickly as he half-turned and faced his accuser. Only this, answered Jules Dubarge determinedly. Silence for silence. You understand now, my friend, silence for silence. And then the two men parted. The morning dawned bright and sunny, the morning of Mary's wedding day, one of those fresh, brilliant days in June when the grass country looks its gladdest and best. The bells were pealing merrily from the old church tower of Orton in honour of the event. Upon the lawn a large marquee had been erected, and the men down from London with the wedding breakfast were bustling everywhere, while the excitement out in the village was intense. Marini and his wife were both happy at the match, and in the long dining room some of the presents were displayed, including a splendid pearl collar from Her Majesty the Queen of Italy. The house was full of visitors, several of them being persons of the highest aristocracy in Italy, who had been specially invited over for the wedding, and there was gaiety everywhere. The only person who took no part in the bustle was the bride herself, for alone in her bright little room she was upon her knees, imploring the divine aid for strength in that hour of her greatest trial. During those past weeks, as each day brought her nearer that hateful union, she had pondered deeply, trying to devise some means by which to escape. But alas, she saw too well that refusal would only bring ruin upon her father's head, while if she did marry Dubard, she had no security that the blow would not fall upon her family afterwards. So she had been compelled to bow to the inevitable, to make that sacrifice of her love, of her very life. Those who had seen her in Rome lolling in her splendid carriage drawn by that perfect pair of English bays, dancing in those gilded salons, or laughing with her neighbour at dinner at one or other of the foreign embassies, had surely never dreamed that that bright, happy girl, whose engagement was discussed everywhere, had such a heavy burden of sorrow within her young heart. Before her lay her bridal gown, a magnificent creation from the Rue de la Paix, with old lace that had once belonged to the extinct royal house of Naples. But when she gazed upon it, she burst into a flood of tears, and sank again upon her knees in desperation. Teresa came at last and tried to calm her. "Signorina, signorina," she exclaimed, stroking the dark hair which, unbound, fell upon her shoulders. "Your eyes will look so red. Oh, surely you should be happy today." "Happy," groaned the unfortunate girl bitterly, as she slowly staggered to her feet. "There is no happiness for me. None, none." At last the pale-faced girl, summoning up all the courage she possessed, seated herself before the mirror, and having allowed Teresa to dress her hair for the bridal, proceeded, with the help of Santina, her mother's maid, her mother, and Vi Walters, who was one of the wedding guests, to put on the gown with its wonderful train and real orange blossoms from the orangery at San Donato. Meanwhile, however, in the study below, Camillo Morini was sitting with his enemy, Angelo Boselli, who had practically invited himself on a flying visit to the ceremony, and whom he could not well refuse without giving him a direct insult. Morini hated the man who had ever been his evil genius, but in the present circumstances dared not openly quarrel with him. Therefore he treated him with diplomatic friendliness. They were smoking their cigars together when Dubard, elegantly dressed, entered merrily and greeted them. Boselli had only arrived late on the previous night, therefore he had not seen him before. "Well, my friend," cried the Sicilian, "I congratulate you. You will have the best of wives in all the world, and the best of fathers-in-law, that I'm sure." "Ah, I'm certain I shall," replied the bridegroom. "But what great preparations are being made!" "Half the country will be here to the reception later on," Morini remarked, laughing. "Where is your secretary, Macbean?" inquired Dubard. "He is not here yet. He is staying with his uncle over at Thornby," was His Excellency's reply. And the bridegroom smiled to himself. His words of the previous night would, he knew, have their effect. Silence for silence. End of chapter 38.
Chapter 39 of Behind the Throne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Anita Shahbazian. Behind the Throne by William LeQue. Revelations. At that moment, however, the door suddenly opened, causing the three men to turn and glance, when, to their surprise, they saw, standing before them, the man whose name had just been mentioned. Dubard held his breath. Macbean's face was bloodless, his lips quivered, his hands were clenched, his whole countenance seemed to have altered in those moments of tension and determination. And as he closed the door behind him and advanced boldly into the room, trying to speak in a cool voice, he addressed the minister. "Your Excellency, the tragedy of this marriage must not take place, for your own sake, as well as for your daughter's. In an instant, the three men were upon their feet, electrified by the Englishman's startling words. "What do you mean?" asked Marini, looking at him amazed. "Yes," cried Dubard, stepping forward angrily. "Let us hear what this fellow means." "You wish to hear!" exclaimed MacBean, facing the Frenchman boldly. "Then listen. I allege that Miss Marini has been forced into this marriage by you, and by that man there," he added, pointing to the sallow-faced Sicilian. "If you doubt me," he said, turning to the Minister of War, "ask her yourself. This man Dubard made a promise to her that in exchange for her hand, he would prevent the crisis which Borselli had arranged to bring ruin and disgrace upon you. You will recollect the mysterious letter received by Montebruno when he was already upon his feet in the chamber. That letter was sent by your enemy, Borselli, at Dubard's instigation, because your poor daughter had consented to sacrifice herself in order to save you. It is my duty to tell you this, Your Excellency. You have been pleased to take me into your service, to treat me almost as a confidential friend, and it is my duty, therefore, to speak the truth and to save Miss Mary from falling the victim of this man." "Victim!" cried Dubard quickly. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you intend to marry her, and having done so, your friend here, General Angelo Borselli, will strike his blow at His Excellency, a merciless blow that will crush and ruin him." "Bah!" exclaimed the Sicilian. "All this is a mere fiction. He loves your daughter himself, my dear Camillo. There is lots of gossip about it in Rome. During my employment in the ministry, I have kept both ears and eyes open," MacBean went on. "I know well with what devilish ingenuity you have plotted against your chief, how you have forced him deeper and deeper into financial intrigue, in order that your revelations may be the greater, and how. In order to propitiate your accomplice Dubard, you have stayed your hand until this marriage is effected." "Basta!" cried the Sicilian. "I will not be insulted by a common employee like you." "Nor I!" exclaimed Dubard, his face white with passion, as he turned to MacBean. "My affairs are no concern of yours. They concern myself and the lady who is to become my wife. I am amazed that you, of all men, should dare to come forward and make these unfounded charges against us. Hitherto I have kept my silence, but as you have sought exposure, I will speak the truth. Then your employer shall judge as to which of us is worthy of confidence, and which." "I make no plea for myself," declared George, quickly interrupting him. "I merely intervene on behalf of a broken and defenseless woman, the woman you have so cleverly entrapped." But Dubard only laughed dryly and said, "Very well, let His Excellency listen to you, and afterwards to me." "Then let me speak first," cried the Englishman desperately. "Let me tell you myself the truth of the Sazerac affair." Borselli's face fell, and Marini's countenance changed color in an instant. Mention of that name was sufficient to cause both men quick apprehension. "You need not do that," the Sicilian managed to say. "But I will," MacBean went on. "You shall hear me. I know the truth is an unwelcome one, but lest others shall tell you any garbled version of it, I will be frank and fearless with you. In the winter 3 years ago, I was taken by Mr. Morgan Mason, whose secretary I was, to stay with General Felix Sazerac, whose wife was my employer's elder sister, the younger sister having married a Mr. Fitzroy. The general, who was in command of the French garrisons on the Alpine frontier, lived at the Villa Puget, at Mentone, and at the Hotel National there was staying his friend Dubard, the man before you. We became friendly, for the general often invited Dubard to dine at the villa, and after a time there arrived in Mentone at the same hotel an acquaintance of the Count's, a young Italian gentleman of means named Solaro, who was also introduced at the Villa Puget, and who also became one of our intimate friends. Curiously enough, however, the general did not seem to care for Solaro's company, yet he frequently invited me to ride out with him, and gave me good mounts from the barracks. Well, he went on after a slight pause. All went merrily for over 2 months, until one day when Mr. Morgan Mason had gone to Marseille. The general invited me to ride with him up into the mountains to the fortress above St. Martin-Lantosque, which he had to inspect. The morning was a bright one, with all the prospects of a blazing day, and we first rode across the plain behind Mentone, and then began to ascend the rough mountain paths into the Alps. We had ridden some 14 miles or so when the general suddenly exclaimed, "That rascally servant of mine has forgotten my flask again." "Never mind," I called to him. "I have mine. I filled it with cognac and water before starting." "That's good," he laughed. "We shall want a drink before long. It's going to be a blazer today." And then we toiled on and on, up the steep rough paths that wound higher and higher over the mountains. Just before midday, however, the general pulled up, removed his cap, and declaring that he was thirsty, took a long pull at the flask I handed to him. "And then?" asked Marini almost involuntarily as he stood listening to the story. I was not thirsty myself, so I put the flask back into the holster and we rode on again, laughing together and enjoying the glorious panorama at our feet. Half an hour later, however, my companion complained of queer pains in his head and giddiness, which he attributed to the sun, and pulling up he dismounted. We were then in a lonely spot in a district utterly unknown to me. The general grew worse, being seized by strange cramping pains in the stomach and a curious twitching of the face. I gave him some water from a spring close by and bathed his head, but he grew worse, and seemed to lapse into a state of coma. Suddenly he opened his eyes, and motioning to me that he wished to speak, he gasped faintly, "Tell them I did it because those Jews were pressing me. I regret, but it is useless." Then after a pause he managed to articulate, "My wife, my dear wife, my love to her, Monsieur MacBean, my love to her, I." Then his jaw dropped, and I found him dead upon my arm. This fatal seizure appalled me. I shouted, but no one heard. I was miles and miles from civilization in the center of the wildest district of the Alps. Therefore I covered the dead man's face with his handkerchief, tethered his horse, and rode back 10 miles or so to a little village we had passed. The general was brought back to Mentone that night, and at the Villa Puget the scene was a sad and tragic one. I gave poor Madame her husband's dying message, but his words about the Jews puzzled her. She could not understand them in the least. It was a mystery. "They were words invented by you," declared Dubard in a hard tone. "Tell these gentlemen the truth. It was you who gave the poor fellow the cognac, you who poisoned him." "I gave him the brandy, I admit," exclaimed MacBean quickly. "But I swear I was unaware that it was poisoned. You filled it from the bottle in your room. Now you have gone so far, tell the whole truth." "I am not afraid," MacBean went on boldly. "On the night when the body of the general was brought home, you came with Solaro to my room, locked the door, and charged me with administering poison. Although 3 doctors had seen him, and as they had all previously treated him for a malady which they knew might terminate fatally on too violent exercise, they had decided that no post-mortem examination was necessary. Your allegation astounded me, but you asked for the key of the cupboard wherein I kept the bottle of brandy. There was some remaining, as well as the remains of that mixed with water in the flask. As I denied that I had poisoned him, you both urged that, in satisfaction, I should seal both bottle and flask and submit them to some analyst in Paris. This I willingly did, entirely unsuspecting any plot. I packed them in a box and myself saw them dispatched. "And the analyst's report is here," exclaimed Dubard, waving the paper triumphantly before the speaker's eyes. "It proves that you deliberately poisoned General Sazerac, while Solaro, if he were here, could prove further that he found in your writing case the draft which you stole from the dead man's pocket. "I know only too well circumstantial evidence that was against me," said McBean, addressing Morini. "I had been the victim of a clever and ingenious plot in which the unfortunate officer had lost his life. But why? There seemed no motive whatever. I returned to England a suspected man, and from that day I did not come face to face with Dubarre until I recognized him last year driving on the Rugby Road, and heard to my amazement that he was engaged to your daughter Mary. Ever since then I have desired to re-encounter this man, and to clear myself of the terrible charge he brings against me." "And how do you propose to do that?" inquired His Excellency, astonished at the entirely new complexion placed upon that tragic affair which had caused him so much mental anxiety and so many sleepless nights. "I can only declare my complete innocence. I was, no doubt, the agent who administered the fatal cognac, but I certainly was ignorant of it, and would never have poisoned the man who had showed me so many kindnesses." "Then I think it is only in the interests of justice if this report of the analyst is given into the hands of the Paris police," remarked the Sicilian, who had remained silent, but whose active mind nevertheless had been at work to discern some means of effectually closing McBean's mouth. The young Englishman started. He had not expected such a suggestion. He foresaw the difficulty of proving his innocence when such witnesses as Solaro and Dubarre were against him. "For the present we will leave that aside," said the minister, in as quiet a voice as he could. "My first duty as father of my child is to investigate this allegation of McBean's," and he touched the bell. To the man who answered his summons he said in English in a determined tone, "Ask Miss Mary to kindly step down here for one moment. I desire to see her without a minute's delay. Say that I have some urgent news for her." "Very good, Your Excellency." And the door was closed again. Dubarre and Borselli exchanged uneasy glances, but a dead silence had fallen between the four men, a silence that was broken by the sound of wheels out on the gravelled drive. There were lots of coming and going in that bustling day, wedding guests arriving, and the bride's luggage being dispatched, so as to meet her in London before they left for Paris on the following morning. The pause was painful. McBean looked at the pair who had for so long been united hand and glove against the minister, and recognized the spirit of murder in their glance. They would have killed him had they dared, for they knew too well that he had now revealed to the minister the actual truth. Borselli, who had enticed him to Rome, hoping to ensure his secrecy over the Sazerac affair, had placed his own head in the lion's mouth by so doing. It was seldom he made an error in his clever schemes, but he knew that he had done so on this occasion, and that it would require all his ingenuity and cunning to escape from such a compromising situation. The minutes passed, but neither spoke a word. Each man feared to utter a sentence lest it should be seized upon and misconstrued, while the minister himself, silent and distinguished-looking, glanced from one to the other, and waited for his beloved daughter to enter and to speak. End of chapter 39.
Chapter 40 of Behind the Throne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Behind the Throne by William Le Queux. The Story of Captain Solaro. At last there was a light footstep out in the hall. The door opened, and she entered, radiant in her wonderful bridal gown and orange blossoms, her long sweeping train behind, but without her veil, of course, her beautiful face revealed in all its haggard pallor. Dubarre sprang forward to welcome her, but ere he could take her hand, he fell back in utter dismay, for behind her, silhouetted in the doorway, stood the figure of a man in a grey felt hat and a light overcoat. "Great heavens!" gasped McBean, who at the same moment recognized the newcomer. "Solaro! Felice Solaro!" "Yes," replied the other, in a quiet, distinct voice,
as he came into the room behind the minister's daughter in her rustling silks. "I am fortunately here, not by His Excellency's decree, but by the generous clemency of the king himself, who, on the occasion of his birthday, 3 days ago, and in consequence of a petition of my family, gave me my liberty with others. I heard what was in progress, and so I have travelled here to ascertain the truth, and to clear myself of the base and scandalous charges those men who stand there have brought against me." And he raised his finger, and pointed to the Sicilian and the Frenchman, both of whose faces had, on the instant of recognizing him, become entirely changed. "It seems, Signorina," he said in Italian, turning his pale, emaciated face to Mary, who stood in the centre of the room, utterly dumbfounded at the dramatic scene, "it seems that, by good fortune, I am here in order to save you, your father, and the Signor McBean from these 2 men who have so very cleverly plotted your father's ruin, your own marriage, the disgrace of the Signor Englishman, and my own imprisonment." "Do you allege that they conspired to obtain the conviction against you?" cried the minister, amazed. "Listen, and I will tell you everything. Then you yourself shall take what steps against them that you desire." "I shall not remain to hear that traitor's insults," cried the Sicilian, moving quickly towards the door. But Solaro, noticing his action, stepped back, locked the door behind him, and placed the key in his pocket, saying, "You will remain, General. You have to answer to me." Then, after a brief pause, he commenced. "It may be news to you all, except the Undersecretary, that Jules Dubar is not a member of the French nobility at all, but a person who, while posing as a count, is one of the secret agents of the French Minister of War. It was for this reason that he desired to be married in England, as the unwelcome truth would have been shown upon his papers." "A spy?" gasped the bride, standing open-mouthed on the eve of her deliverance. "That is the vulgar term for such persons," Solaro said. "It happened about 4 years ago that Borsellian he met, and the former, finding him a shrewd and clever adventurer, resolved to make use of him to gain a triumph over the minister Morini. Borselli had also met General Sazerac at the Jockey Club in Paris, and had won from him several large sums at cards, accepting from him a number of promissory notes. Having done this, he discovered, to his delight, that Sazerac was actually in command of the Alpine frontier of France. Therefore, he proceeded with slow deliberation to win over Dubar from the French service, by promises of position when the minister Morini was overthrown, and to unfold a plot which is a good specimen of his amazing ingenuity. Briefly, it was to place the promissory notes in the hands of some unscrupulous Jews in Antwerp, in order that they should press for payment, and when they did so, Dubar, who was attached to Sazerac's division of the French army, should suggest a course out of the difficulty, namely, to sell to the Italian Ministry of War certain plans of the frontier defences which we were very anxious to obtain. This was done. Sazerac, in desperate straits for money, listened to his friend Dubar's evil counsel, and agreed to allow the plans of the whole of the defences, from Mount Pelvoux to the sea, to be copied for a sum of 200,000 francs. These were the secrets which we had desired for many years to know, and the first I knew of the matter was a summons to the ministry in Rome, where I saw Borselli, who introduced me to Dubar, and instructed me, because I spoke French perfectly, and was a good draughtsman, to go to Menton, take quarters at the Hôtel National, and make copies in secret of certain documents which Dubar would hand me from time to time. "You were in our service," declared the Sicilian. "Certainly," he answered, and then proceeding, he said, "I went to Menton and commenced the work of copying those plans, which the General allowed Dubar to abstract from the safe at headquarters, and bring to me in secret. While there, we both became on friendly terms with the Englishman, McBean, who was secretary to the French general's brother-in-law, and who was, of course, in entire ignorance of what was in progress. After about 2 months, during which Dubar and I led the life of wealthy idlers on the Riviera, the copying was complete. I had sent the last batch of tracings to Rome by the official of the ministry, who came specially to convey them, and was awaiting further instructions when one evening, after we had seen McBean and the General going out for a ride together, Dubar entered the hotel and said he had heard in a café the startling report of the General's sudden death. We at once went round to the Villa Puget, and there, sure enough, he was lying dead, with Madame inconsolable with grief. The doctors had declared death due to natural causes, as he had long been an invalid, and had been warned against riding too far. But Dubar took me aside in the garden, and told me that he held a distinct suspicion that the General had been poisoned. The sum agreed to be paid for the plans had, he said, been paid on the previous day, and probably he had some of it upon him, which might serve as a motive for the crime. He suggested poison, and declared that he had suspicion of McBean. At first I refused to entertain such a theory, but he persisted in it, and at his suggestion I accompanied him when he openly charged the Englishman with the crime. McBean at once offered us every facility for the analyzing of the cognac and the contents of his flask, sealed them up with his own seal, and packed them before our eyes, addressing them to a well-known chemist in the Rue Rivoli in Paris, and I dispatched them. The report came back that there was an arsenical poison in both the bottle and the flask. It seemed that McBean had tried to bluff us to the very last, but the most damning fact was that, on searching his effects, I discovered a draft on the Credit Lyonnaise for 50,000 francs from a firm in Genoa, but really emanating from our Ministry of War, and part of the agreed payment for the plans. This was concealed in the flap of his writing case. So the natural conclusion was that Mr. McBean was a poisoner, remarked Mary, standing dumbfounded. Of course, he said, I certainly believed that he was, and that he was only allowed his liberty through Dubar's clemency, until about 3 months after the affair, when Dubar and I, being together at the Grand Hotel in Venice, my curiosity was one day aroused, and I pried into his despatch box during his absence. Among other papers, I found this letter, he said, producing one from his pocket. It is undated and unsigned, but it suggests that if some secret means were employed to induce S's, meaning Sazerac, of course, fatal illness, 2 ends would be achieved. France would never suspect that he had sold the plans, and the payment of 200,000 francs need not be made. 50,000 francs of that money Borselli handed back to me, the minister admitted. And he kept the remainder himself, declared Solaro. This letter is in his handwriting, and is in itself evidence that he instigated the General's death, and that this man, who is his accomplice, carried it out so cleverly that the whole of the evidence pointed to McBean. Indeed, this is proved by recent events, and by the manner in which the pair have sought to close my mouth regarding the ugly affair. Last summer I was suddenly arrested, and was amazed to discover how very neatly the man Dubar, whom I thought my friend, had had me watched in Paris, and in Bologna had bogus plans of the Trecenta prepared and sent to Filomena Nodari, and how these and other documents, one purporting to be the mobilization scheme itself, passed through that woman's hands into those of a French agent. Evidence, foul lies, all of it, was given against me. I was condemned as a traitor. I, the man who had copied all the plans of France in the interests of my own country, and then I realized how cleverly Borselli and Dubar, the ex-agent of France, were acting in conjunction, and that whoever was guilty of poor Sazerac's assassination, it certainly was not the Englishman. I had, before my arrest, mentioned the death of Sazerac casually to Dubar, and inquired of the whereabouts of McBean. It was this remark of mine which apparently aroused his suspicions, and which caused both he and Borselli to secure my imprisonment for a twofold reason. First, to ensure my silence, and secondly, so as to give the Socialists a weapon by which they might hound your Excellency from office for countenancing a traitor. This was the only way in which your Excellency's popularity and power could be undermined. But so craftily did they go to work, and so cleverly was every detail of the conspiracy thought out, even to the opening of your safe at San Donato, with a key made from the impression of the original key taken by Borselli 2 years before. You made away with the keys, hoping to conceal the evidences of your peculations. but their ingenuity was simply marvelous, for they were playing with the safety and prosperity of a kingdom. "But General Borselli asked me recently to induce my father to release you," said Mary, "in order to still further incite the popular feeling against His Excellency. He probably believed that I dared not denounce him as the instigator of the assassination of Sazerac, and that, with my release, his coup could be effected against your father after your marriage with his accomplice. It is indeed intended to strike the blow at the first sitting of the Chamber next month." "Then I think we are now fully prepared to combat it," remarked the tall, grey-haired minister in a cool tone, as he glanced at the Sicilian. "When I received the 50,000 francs of the sum which was to have been paid from the Secret Service Fund to General Sazerac, I was led to believe that, owing to a certain plan not being forthcoming, only half the sum had been paid to him. I had no knowledge of a tragedy until long afterwards, when, to my horror, I discovered for myself that there had been some foul play, and that I was morally responsible as an accessory." "I am not to blame altogether," declared the Frenchman desperately. "Borselli sent me the cognac from Rome already prepared, and according to his directions, I substituted the bottle in the Englishman's room, and, at the same time, abstracted the General's flask from his holster. I also concealed, at Angelo's suggestion, the banker's draft in McBean's writing case." "You scoundrel!" cried George, turning upon the white-faced criminal whom his well-beloved had so narrowly escaped. "And you, Borselli, have sent your spy, that woman Nodari, to investigate Mr. Morgan Mason's papers because you fear he holds something that incriminates you?" "Silence!" cried the minister, holding up his hand. "There must be no recriminations here in my house. I have been misled by Borselli as to the man's position and antecedents. The wedding will not take place after these scandalous revelations, but there is still one duty before me, as Minister of War." And turning to his writing table, he took 2 sheets of paper, and upon each he scribbled some hurried words. One he handed to Borselli, who glanced at it and threw it from him with an imprecation. It was his dismissal from the office of Under-Secretary of War. The other, which he handed to Solaro, caused him to cry aloud with joy, for it was his reinstatement in the army and a declaration of his innocence of the crime of which he had been charged. Then Solaro unlocked the door, and turning to the Sicilian and Dubar, who were standing together pale, crestfallen, and ashamed, he said, "Go, you pair of assassins. Don't either of you put foot in Italy again, or I'll take it upon myself to prosecute you for your vile plot and my own false imprisonment. Then, at your trial, the whole affair will come out. You hear?" "Yes," muttered Dubar, with flashing eyes. "We hear your threats." And in silence, both the elegant bridegroom and his dark-faced friend passed from the study and out of the house, never to re-enter it. Then, when they had gone, Mary, a pale, tragic figure in her bridal dress, flung herself into George's ready arms, crying, "You have saved me! Saved me!" And she burst into tears of joy, the outpourings of an overburdened heart. For the first time, Camillo Morini guessed the truth, and yet, then and there, before Felice Solaro, whose statement had liberated both of them, George McBean openly confessed his great passion for her, a declaration of purest and strongest affection, of which she, by her own action, had already acknowledged reciprocation. And so the minister, on recovering from his surprise, gladly gave the hand of his daughter to the gallant, upright man who had placed himself in such jeopardy in order to save her and to unmask the conspirators, while Felice Solaro was the first to offer the pair his hearty congratulations. Hand in hand they stood, content in each other's love. In order to preserve appearances, it was arranged that Mary should feign a sudden illness to necessitate the postponement of the wedding, and while there was great disappointment among the guests and the curious crowds of villagers, there was, in secret, a great rejoicing in Madame Morino's little boudoir when the glad news was revealed to her. The pealing bells were stopped. Mary had thrown off her wedding gown merrily, and when she tossed her orange blossoms into the grate of the boudoir, she said to George, laughingly, "When we marry privately in London next month, I shall require no white satin. A traveling gown will be sufficient, will it not?" "Yes, dearest," he said, kissing her fondly upon the lips, now that she was really his very own. "The dress does not matter when the union of our hearts is so firm and true. You know how fondly and passionately I love you, and how I have suffered in silence at the thought of your terrible sacrifice." "I know," she answered softly, looking up into his eyes trustingly. "I know, George, only too well. Ah, you cannot think how happy I am, now that it is all past, and you are mine." And then she raised her sweet face and kissed him of her own accord upon the cheek. End of chapter 40. Read by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona, May 8, 2024.
Chapter 41 of Behind the Throne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Stacey M. Behind the Throne by William LeQueux. A Woman's Freedom. Within a month of the abandoned wedding at Orton, Mary Marini and George McBean were married quietly at St. James Church in Piccadilly, the Rev. Basil Sinclair assisting, and Billy Grenfell, as full of his bluff humor as ever, acting as best man, while among the various handsome presents the happy pair received was an acceptable check from Mr. Morgan Mason for £10,000, the sum he had offered to George for information as to the actual means by which his brother-in-law met with his death. The millionaire was determined to place the assassins on their trial, and notwithstanding Marini's efforts to preserve secrecy regarding the affair, he actually gave information to the chief of police in Mentone. By some secret means, Angelo Berselli obtained knowledge of this fact, and on the very morning of George's wedding day, he was found in a room in an obscure hotel in Brussels, quite dead, having committed suicide by swallowing some arsenical poison, probably the same as that used in the cognac which caused the unfortunate general's tragic end. Felice Solaro was soon gazetted major, and is now transferred to the gaiety of Naples. As for Dubard, he did not long enjoy his freedom, for he was arrested as a traitor by the French police while passing through Bordeaux, and is now spending the remainder of his days on the penal island of New Caledonia. George McBean and his charming wife still live in Rome, and all in the Eternal City know them well by sight. The Cavalier McBean has been promoted to a very high and responsible position in the Ministry of War, but last year Camillo Marini, owing to failing health, resigned office, greatly to the regret of his new sovereign, King Victor Emmanuel, and of the gallant Italian people at large. But before resigning, he endeavored, by every means in his power, to atone for the peculations of his earlier career, and by selling his palace and other properties, he paid back the whole of the money he had appropriated. San Donato, the old world estate above Florence, is, however, still his, and there, enjoying the greatest fame perhaps of any living Italian, he is spending with his wife the evening of his days. Orton Court is still rented by him, and each summer they go there with Mary and her husband, but the village is still mystified why Miss Mary did not marry the Frenchman, and whether, after all, there was not a scene on that memorable day when the wedding was so abruptly postponed. But in her fine dark eyes they now see the light of perfect love and sweet contentment, and they know too well the sterling worth and kindly heart of the man who is her husband. In Orton village in summer, however, perhaps the most popular and important personage of any is the little round-faced, chubby boy, who so often sits between the happy pair when on bright afternoons they drive out in the smart Victoria. Much as she prefers England, Madame McBean is compelled, on account of her husband's official position, to still move in Roman society, where, for her great personal beauty and the sweetness of her character, she is the most admired of women in the Curinelli set, that bright and brilliant circle of Italy's bluest blood, the world behind the throne. End of chapter 41. End of Behind the Throne by William LeQueux.